to Sarah, who's going to kick off today's session.
Great. Thanks very much, Claire, and good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you. Thank you very much for coming back. We hope you enjoyed Thursday evening, and we're going to be covering a lot more content today, but also there'll be a lot more time for discussion today and for getting to know your Assembly members a bit more too. So just to let you know some changes to the team. So today our wellbeing support is provided by Rob. I think, Rob, you've already said good morning, but if you wouldn't mind giving a quick wave. So just to remind you, if anybody wants to access the wellbeing support, please direct message Rob through the chat facility. So he'll come up as Rob Wellbeing Support. And remember as well, Francis is on hand for any IT support that's required. So just to let you know, we're not going to keep you working all day without a break. We're not quite that mean. So we've got a mid-morning break, which I think, I can't remember the exact time of that, but I think it's around about 11:15. And then we also have lunch. So lunch is at 12:45 to 1:45. We will ensure that you have your full 1 hour for lunch, no matter what's happening with timings. But we do hope to keep the time much better today. So just to cover what we're going to be doing. So we're looking this morning at emissions. So emissions at both a UK perspective and also a Herefordshire perspective. And then we're covering why climate change is so difficult to tackle. So we've got 3 speakers for you on those topics. But before we do that, we're going to revisit the conversation guidelines, which you all worked hard to produce the other night. Thank you very much for that. They're great. And also we're going to hear a short video, which just kind of prepares us for the mode we need to be in when we're listening to evidence. So that's it for today. After the presentations, as you might expect, we'll go into a Q&A. That Q&A is going to work slightly differently than it did the other day, so it's going to be through plenary. So the first thing we're going to do is just kick you off with some discussion in your small groups. Max, are we ready to move into small groups? Yes, brilliant, thank you. So we're just going to give you a chance to say hello to one another and just to share any thoughts that you had from Thursday with your group facilitators. So see you back here in about 15 minutes.
Okay, welcome everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that brief sort of time with your facilitators just to reconnect. So we're now going to share with you a video by Alan Rennick called How to Approach Evidence. You're going to be hearing lots of different evidence from lots of different people again today and over the course of the weekend. This video was first produced for the Scottish Climate Assembly, but it's subsequently been used by lots of different climate assemblies. So Max, if we can ready to roll, and share that with you.
Hello, my name's Alan Rennick. I'm from University College London. I've worked with citizens' assemblies all around the country, and I've been asked to say just a few words about how we approach listening to evidence. You're going to be hearing a lot of evidence over the course of the assembly, and it's useful just to think about how to go about doing that. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. Firstly, I'll say a little bit about the types of evidence that you'll be hearing. Then secondly, I'll talk about how to think about what the speakers are saying. And then thirdly, I'll talk about how to think about how we ourselves listen to those speakers. So firstly, on types of evidence, I think you'll be hearing 2 broad kinds of evidence over the coming weekends. You'll hear evidence from each other, and you'll also hear evidence from witnesses. So the evidence from each other is just fantastic. You'll have great conversations with people you've never had conversations with before about all sorts of things, and you'll learn so much about people from very different walks of life, very different kinds of experience. And I know from the work that I've done with citizens' assemblies just how valuable that is to participants. So that's really great. Of course, it's important to remember that you're not experts. You're not speaking with experts when you're speaking with members of the assembly. You're here as members of the public. That's why you're so important. But that's really, really valuable evidence. And then second, you'll be hearing from witnesses, people who come in and address the assembly. And there'll be various different kinds of witnesses. There'll be, for example, scientists who've done research on the issues and come up with detailed findings. There will be advocates who argue for particular points of view and particular positions, particular policies. And there will be stakeholders, people who have a stake in the issues, whose lives will be affected by the policy decisions that you're talking about. So it's important to think about those different kinds of witnesses that you'll be hearing, and just to reflect on what can you expect from them? What kinds of evidence will they be giving? What might you need to be careful of when listening to those different kinds of speaker as well? Moving on then to my second topic, thinking about what speakers are saying. So I'm going to give you Alan's 4 top tips for the things that I think you should be asking yourself when listening to speakers. First, most simply, what are the speakers' key points? What are they trying to say? So sometimes that's really clear. Other times you need to do a bit of work yourself in order to work it out. Second, are they backing up their claims with good evidence and arguments? So all of the speakers will be making claims about what's happening in the world or about what the effects of different policies would be. And it's really important to consider, are they actually backing that up with evidence? Are they really convincing you? Are they giving you the material that you need in order to come to a considered judgment? Third, why might someone take a different view? So think while you're listening to the speakers about, well, what might the counter arguments be? What might the other perspectives be on this? And just consider that and think about what questions you might want to put to the speakers during the Q&A. And then finally, thinking across the various different speakers, often they'll disagree with each other. And then it's really good to think, well, why are they disagreeing? Are they disagreeing because they're thinking about the problem in slightly different ways, or they're looking at different kinds of evidence, or they're interpreting the evidence in different ways? Just understanding those differences among the speakers and why they differ from each other is really useful for you in helping to work out what you conclude on the basis of the various different things that you hear. And then the third thing that I want to talk about is thinking about how we ourselves listen. So I guess the ideal in a citizens' assembly is that we're giving everyone a fair hearing. We're listening to everyone equally. But we know that we're all human beings, and it's just really difficult for human beings to do that. We all tend, in fact, to listen to different people in different ways and listen more effectively to some people than to others. And that's because we have what we often refer to as biases in how we listen. So it's just really important to be aware of those different biases that we have. And I'll highlight just a few. So one is we're better at listening to people who present well. So if someone who's presenting is really engaging and they're funny, then it's really easy to listen to them, really easy to kind of get involved. But actually, it could be that the speakers who are a bit more tentative, a bit less flashy, they might have important things to say as well. So it's important to try to get beyond the presentation to hear what they're saying. We're better at listening to people who we think are like us. So there's lots of evidence that, for example, men are a bit better at listening to men, women are a bit better at listening to women. We tend to be best at listening to people who are the same kind of age as us or have similar accents to us. You know, all these kinds of things make a difference to how we listen. And again, if we're trying to focus in on what people are actually saying, then it's good to try to get beyond those initial impressions. We're better at hearing things that fit with what we already think. So this is really, really important. So I'm guilty of this, you're guilty of this, we're all guilty of this. We all tend to find that it's really easy if we agree with something to say, yeah, that's what I think, that's good. Whereas if something doesn't fit with what we already think, then we're inclined to go, oh no, that can't be right. I don't agree with that. Again, that's not giving everyone a fair hearing. That's not keeping an open mind. And in a citizens' assembly, we really do want to have an open mind and do want to be kind of led by all the evidence that we're listening to. So again, it's good to try to move beyond that if we can. Individual stories move us more than evidence about lots of nameless people. So individual stories about particular people, we can relate to them, we can sympathize, it makes sense to us, we can feel it, and it's easy to remember. Whereas the evidence about the general patterns across the population, that can be a bit harder to get into, it can be drier. But again, that evidence, the general evidence, can be really important. I'm not saying the individual stories are not important, but just trying to get the balance right between those different kinds of evidence is really good. We're worried about being liked. So this is a bit different from the others. This is more about when we're having conversations in the group about the evidence that we've heard. And it can be easy to hear people in the group saying things, various different people, if they agree with each other, you might think, oh, maybe I should just go along with that as well, because I want to fit in. I don't want to feel like I'm sticking out. But actually, you know, Citizens Assembly is all about bringing together people with really different perspectives, different views, different life experiences. And it's absolutely fine if you have a slightly different view or a very different view from other people in the group. So it's really important not to be shy and to be willing to say what you think. That's what you're here for, to say what you think on these issues. And then finally, we're better at remembering the arguments that we heard last. So I want you to do a little experiment on yourself at the end of the session, the end of this afternoon. Just think back to this presentation. So he was talking about those various different biases. Which of them can I actually remember? And I bet for a lot of you, the one that you'll remember first is that you remember the argument that you heard last. Just because you heard it last, it's easy to remember. So do just remember, if you hear a range of different speakers talking, it's very tempting just to focus on the last one, because that's the one that's easiest to remember. But try to go back to the earlier speakers as well and reflect on what they said too. They're equally important. Okay, that's all from me. Over to you now. So thank you for listening, and I wish you all the very best for the work of the Citizens Assembly.
Okay, so we thought that was a really nice way of leading into revisiting the conversation guidelines that you started to put together at the end of Thursday night's session. So we've reviewed all of those and we've collated them. So there were some really good themes that came out and a lot of kind of commonality around all the different conversations that you had across your 5 groups. So what we've done is we've brought those all in together. I'm just going to share those conversation guidelines with you now, just so that you can be reminded of them, see what they look like as a complete set of guidelines. So Max, if you can just share those with the group now, and I will run through those with us. And these are going to form a really important part of the foundation, really, of all the conversations that we're going to have over the rest of this weekend and next weekend. Okay, so the first one, which was about actively listening to other people. So really tuning into what people are saying. There was another one around not interrupting people or talking over people. The theme around patience came up a lot. You know, let's be patient with other people in terms of getting them to articulate their views and feelings. Respecting other people's views, exactly what Alan Rennick has just said. You know, you're going to be hearing from lots of different people with different perspectives from your own. Think about the language that we use, you know, making sure that we use language that everybody will understand. And part of that is about avoiding the use of jargon or acronyms. Encouraging healthy debate. You know, we want to hear different views, different perspectives. You don't have to agree with them. So agreeing to differ, that's exactly what, you know, we need to all sign up to. And just making sure that everybody has the chance to speak. Just go on. Okay. Part of that is about just being inclusive, making sure that everybody feels valued, not going off topic. So we've got very limited time, so keeping to topics really important during the course of the discussions that we have. Trying to make clear and concise points, not always easy, but if you can do that, again, we'll maximise the time we've got in discussions. Try and create a space where people can feel they can be honest and be open about their views. And we're going to introduce a few process-driven things, really. So lots of you said, actually, we think it would be better to start using the raised hand icon if you want to speak. That will help us to not interrupt each other when we're speaking. And if you're not speaking, to try and get into the habit of staying on mute. So there are conversation guidelines. What we're really interested to know is whether you feel that they reflect the conversations that you had with your facilitators about those on Thursday night. So in order to do that, again, we're going to go back to the ticks and crosses. So if you can go back to your reactions button, and if you feel that you're happy with those guidelines, you can sign up to them, give us a big tick. If not, then give us a cross. And as long as we've got a majority of people that feel that they're happy with those, then we'll adopt those and we'll start using them. I think that's the way that we can, you know, bring up kind of keep on track of the conversations we're having, make sure everybody feels that they can engage. Anybody that's not happy with them, maybe you can pick those issues up with your facilitators in the breakout rooms. But as long as we've got the majority of people saying they're happy, I think we go with those. So we've got, yeah, let's see. So is everybody, most people broadly, yeah, 34 of us happy, one not so happy. Maybe with that person that's not so happy can discuss that with their facilitator when we move into the breakout rooms later on. Okay, so we're going to move on now. We're going to start to introduce the speakers. And so I'm going to hand over to Sarah to do that.
Thanks very much, Claire. Yeah, so as Claire said, we've now got 3 speakers, all excellent speakers. The first 2 are going to be looking at emissions. So just following on from what we learned about climate change on Thursday evening, this is looking specifically at emissions and where they come from. So we're going to introduce each speaker in turn. And then the third speaker is Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who's going to be talking to us about why climate change is difficult to tackle. So we're going to hear recorded presentations, just to remind you, but then speakers join us live for a Q&A. So just before we go into those presentations, just to remind yourselves of what you heard through the Alan Bennett video, and just to listen with an open mind and capture down key points and note any questions that you have for those speakers as you go along. Okay, Max, so we're ready for the first video. So our first speaker is Tim Yare from Midlands Energy Hub, and he's looking
Good morning.
He's looking at emissions from a UK perspective. Thanks, Max.
My name's Tim Yare. I'm the Regional Senior Energy Project Officer for the Midlands Energy Hub. My role is to support the local authorities in the Marches region, which include Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin and Herefordshire, to deliver on their net zero ambitions. Just going to share with you a quick presentation. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction and recap on climate change. I know you probably went over this a little bit on Thursday, but it's never doesn't harm to do that again. A bit about the global picture, a little bit about the outputs from COP26, which was the environmental conference that was held in November in Glasgow, and a little bit about then the UK's carbon footprint and the policies that are in place around that. So the planet's average surface temperature has risen by around about 1.2 degrees Celsius during the last century. Globally, the 10 hottest years on record have all been since 2005, and 2020 was the hottest, joined to 2016. And it's likely that 2021 would be around about the 5th or 6th hottest. We'll just have to wait until the final records come in for that. In the UK, the 10 hottest years have all been since 2002. The scientific consensus is that this change has been driven largely by increased carbon dioxide and other human-made emissions being emitted into the atmosphere. This graph is just showing the CO2 from burning of fossil fuels, but it does, and just to give you context, that's not a huge amount of emissions compared to the rest of the atmosphere, being around about, well, pre-industrial, we're up to 280 parts per million. Now we're up to around about 420 parts per million. But it does show that there's still a big increase in the amount being emitted. So it's up from around about 6 billion tonnes in 1950 to around about 34 billion tonnes every year from now. We do see a bit of a downtick at the end of that, which is probably entirely down to the global pandemic. So who's responsible for these emissions? Well, it depends a little bit about how you look at the stats surrounding this. But to give you an idea, the UK now emits around about 450 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. That is only just 1% of the global emissions. But even at that 1% of those territorial emissions, that we're still amongst the top emitting countries in the world. That was 15th on that in that table. If we consider, though, that we've been emitting carbon dioxide for a lot longer than many other countries, and we consider our emissions over time, we're probably the 5th largest emitter of all time. But this perhaps isn't the full picture either, because a lot of the goods and services we now buy come from other countries who have got even higher levels of carbon dioxide emissions, such as China. So what about China? And it's always one of the things that's raised as to why are we bothering when China aren't. I would say that China, while they're not doing as much as we'd like them to, they are doing something. They do now have a net zero target. It's not as ambitious as the UK's. Ours is 2050, theirs is 2060. But they are looking to peak their emissions by the end of the 2020s. However, as everybody will have heard, they do have quite a large number of coal-powered power stations. So it'll be interesting to see how they tie those two things together. The other reason that UK really needs to have a role in this is that we are a leading country. We are one of the wealthiest and most influential countries in the world still. We are part of the G7, the G20, the UN Security Council, and a founding member of NATO. So we have a leadership role to play in tackling global problems. And this is one of the largest global problems that we have to deal with. It's not a new problem though. We've known about environmental issues for many years now. In fact, if we end back 50 years this year, the first UN conference on the environment was held in Stockholm. And since then, we've had a number of important staging posts, which I'd like to quickly touch on now. The first being the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where we signed a non-binding treaty to reduce emissions to 1990 levels. Since then, every 2 years, we've had one of these COP meetings, which is a Conference of the Parties, which is a UN meeting to sort of talk about these topics. One of the most important was in 1997, where the first legally binding agreement to cut emissions by 5.2% by 2012 was agreed. We actually managed to hit that target, but it didn't include some of the larger emitters, so perhaps we didn't get the same sort of impact as we would have liked it to have. We then have to roll on nearly 20 years to Paris in 2016 to find the next big important agreement. And that was signed to keep the temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels. And importantly, was also to look at making sure to see if we could get to 1.5 degrees above that level. In Glasgow this last year, in November, December, we actually came up with a pact to affirm that agreement and try to work out how we keep that 1.5 degrees within reach. What happens in the future is really down to how seriously we take the challenge. If we don't do anything about it, we could be heading towards really catastrophically high levels of warming, up to perhaps even 5 degrees C. We need to be acting now quickly and fast and hard to actually bend that curve around to make sure that we keep it down to 1.5. So how are we going to do that? Well, we came out of Glasgow with the Glasgow Climate Pact. That was where we managed to secure near global net zero targets. So a lot of countries actually signing up to net zero now. They're also been enhancing their own individual countries' contributions. They're called nationally determined contributions. And 153 countries put forward much more enhanced versions of their NDCs, which will help strengthen the potential of getting to net zero. Importantly, we came up with some other projects, other pledges to help countries to do that. So coal power being an important one. 190 countries have agreed now to phase down coal. We've also had 91% of the world's forests covered by a pledge from 137 different countries to end deforestation by 2030, which is a positive step forward. We've also had an agreement to accelerate the transition to EV for both vans and cars. So that will make up quite a significant chunk of any savings. And importantly, we had a pledge from over 100 countries to reduce the amount of global emissions of methane. And that's the first time we've had anything surrounding methane within one of these agreements. Also had some positive work around adaptation. It's important that we actually help those people who are already suffering from the impacts of climate change, such as rising sea levels or much more severe weather. Going along with that is the need for finance. we still haven't quite hit the $100 billion a year goal, which was set back in Paris. We're likely to hit that around about 2023 now, but that is a little bit too late, and we've still got a lot more work to do to get that done. And we still now need to work with others and improve the collaboration between countries to help us achieve those goals. So how are we doing? Well, the Climate Action Tracker sort of helps sort of show how we're going to get there, perhaps. So at the moment, we know where we are, we know what that 1.5 degree goal is, but if we look at the different levels of agreements that we've got in place, if we look at just the current policies and actions that are going on, we're heading towards 2.7 degrees unless we do things about that. If we just consider the targets, the countries' nationally determined contributions that they've already agreed to, that cuts down to around about 2.4 degree rise in temperature. With the other pledges that the countries have signed up to, if we fulfill all of those, we can get that down to around about 2.1 degrees Celsius rise. Only in the most optimistic of scenarios there can we get down to that 1.5 degrees. And so we're really holding on to it by our fingertips, really. So as far as the UK is concerned, we're doing fairly well against our territorial emissions, those are the emissions that we emit from the UK within our boundaries. So we've had about a 50% decline since 1992. So we're doing reasonably well, but that doesn't include emissions from things like aviation or shipping, or even the supply chain of manufactured goods and services which are imported into the UK. So we've still got some way to go. And a large proportion of that is actually due to one sector alone. So the top line there, the orange line, that is the emissions from our power sector, from electricity. And you can see there's been a significant decline, certainly within the last 10 years. And that is what makes up a huge proportion of the UK's reduction so far. We're not doing as well in any of the other sectors, really. So transport and buildings are particular areas which are high emitters and we need to do something about. And that's something that I think we'll be tackling in other sessions. It's not the whole picture, as I mentioned earlier. We've also got those goods and services that are brought into the UK. Emissions surrounding those have only gone down about 14%. So we need to think of ways that we can tackle our consumption. And that really comes down to behaviour change. And again, I think that's something you're going to be discussing in much more detail later on. In terms of what's happening in the UK, we've had a raft of different policies come up in the last year, particularly in the run-up to COP. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's just to demonstrate there is a huge amount of work going on in the background to sort of change the policies within the UK to help us meet our net zero ambitions. But we're not necessarily doing as well against those as we might like. There are only a few areas which are fully on track at the moment, and we need to work with governments at all different levels, at national government, but also at local level, to see where we can put pressure on to make some of these other policies actually meet the ambition that we need to see. And only if we do that can we play our full part in meeting that 1.5 degree warming target. So in summary then, bit of a global picture there. It's a bit of a rush and there's a lot more detail, which I'm sure you'll come back to elsewhere. We've got some implications from COP26. We are a global leader on that. We're the leader until we get to Egypt next year for COP27. So there's plenty of opportunity within that time to increase our NDCs even further, to make our contributions even more telling. And we need to do that in order to get that 1.5 degrees in reach. And we need to do something as well at the local level. And I know that's something you're going to spend a lot more time discussing in the future. So that's it for me. If you've got any more questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those as we go forward in this session. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much to Tim for that presentation. So before we move on, we're just going to take 30 seconds now just to reflect on what Tim has said. And importantly, note down any questions that you may want to ask Tim later on in the Q&A panel. Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker now. So the purpose of the next presentation is to set out the emissions that what we know from Herefordshire, the key emissions that are in Herefordshire. And we're going to hear from Ben Boswell, who's Head of Environment, Climate Emergency and Waste with Herefordshire Council. So can we start that presentation now, Max? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ben Boswell, and I'm the Head of Environment, Climate Emergency and Waste at Herefordshire Council. And this morning I'm going to be giving you a short presentation on carbon emissions across Herefordshire. So that's building on what Tim's just taken us through, looking at national and international, and really focusing down on what our carbon footprint looks like in Herefordshire. So this morning, what I'm going to take you through is really giving you a short overview of the different ways we can measure our carbon footprint and the pros and cons of each. Taking you through how we've currently and how we've historically done our carbon footprint, looking at what's our footprint made up of, what progress have we made to date, and then sort of looking at some benchmarking of how we compare to others and what our footprint looks like compared to theirs. Moving on from that, I was going to touch on a new and improved carbon footprinting method that we've just been looking at, doing a lot of work with the Midlands Energy Hub and BEIS, the government department, which is really looking at a more holistic data set that includes more. And then, as well as that, looking at a new method, which is looking at our consumption-based emissions, which is a slightly different way of looking at it. Then what I was just going to touch on then is a few key considerations and opportunities to try and help get you thinking about different ways you can reduce emissions. And then very lastly, just really to give you a flavour of the Herefordshire Council's carbon footprint and the progress we've made. So just touching on the different type of emissions, historically, we've always looked at what we call territorial emissions, which is very much looking at the emissions that come from consumption in an area. So the pros of this really are it's a very standardized method. This is something that's been around since 2005. All local authorities have been using this approach. And the good thing about that then, it enables us to do benchmarking, to do long-term trends. The problem is it's only relating to energy, so it doesn't include other greenhouse gases like methane. So it's a very, very good, robust data set with a lot of historic data, but we want broader than that. And really that's the new one I'll come on to, which is very much including greenhouse gases and methane in particular, with Herefordshire being an agricultural county, it's such an important part of the puzzle. Problem is though, it doesn't have that historic data. So what we'll be doing is looking at both going forward. And then the third one, as I said, is really around consumption. So instead of looking at what's generated through actually using fuels in an area, it's looking at what's the carbon of what we use, what we purchase, what we eat. And okay, it's slightly different, but it really gives you a better insight into how our behaviours as individuals affects our carbon footprint. So just starting with what we call the territorial emissions, which is very much what is emitted in Herefordshire through our consumption. And as you can see from this one, it's predominantly split into transport, domestic and industry, with transport being the biggest in this area. What's interesting as well is you can see the public sector emissions, which is about 2%. So for example, the council is probably about 1% of the total. And so that's why it's so important that everybody plays their part. This one, the data set is collated by government. It takes them about 2 years to put it together because it's just so many different data sets looking at fuel consumption, mileage, all sorts really, and it all comes together and is published nationally. As I said, I can touch on historic data in a second. And the other thing to consider is it includes a factor for what we call share of national assets. So what the government didn't want to do is unfairly disadvantage anyone that might have an airport or more motorways through, because they consider them as national assets. So what they've done is they've taken that and split it out per population. So within our emissions there'll be a small percentage for things like power stations and motorways. So how are we doing? What's our performance to date? So as you'll be able to see on there, there's two colour lines. The blue one is backdated because we first started to set our targets off the Climate Change Act. But what you can see in red is actually the actual data from Herefordshire. And pleasingly, there's been good progress to date with it coming down. But I think what I've tried to show on this graph using the green dotted line is what our current trajectory looks like. So if we keep going as we're going, we're projecting to get to carbon zero in Herefordshire by 2044. Now, whilst that is quicker than the national target, it's not quick enough for what we've commit to and what we as Herefordshire want to achieve. And so what I've tried to do is to show in that little wedge of cheese at the bottom, that's the size of the challenge, is getting from our current trajectory down to the Herefordshire 2030 challenge. And I mentioned the national target as 2050 because that is actually going to be a bit of a challenge for us, because we want to go faster and we want to be more ambitious. And so what we need to do is we need to really go above and beyond to get there. So just touching on others, I won't go into this one into too much detail, but what I wanted to show was really how our footprint compares to others. And so really the main things to take from this is Herefordshire as a land base, as a very agricultural county, actually has quite a lot of carbon sequestration. And you can see at the bottom there, there's kind of a negative effect of about 9%, which is carbon coming out of the atmosphere and going into trees and other plant life in Herefordshire. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same split as in the other graphs. And it gives you a rough feel that we have slightly higher on industry and commerce in Herefordshire, but otherwise we're fairly reflective of England and other neighbouring authorities. What is interesting is if we compare ourselves to other local authorities in looking at performance, there's a general trend line where we're all coming down at roughly the same rate. But pleasingly, if you look at Herefordshire, we were slightly higher than some of our nearest neighbours and the national average. And whilst we're following the same trajectory, we are starting to accelerate our reductions slightly faster than others. So you'll see that we've kind of gone from the top of the pack to the middle of the pack, which shows some good progress over recent years. So that's territorial emissions and how we used to do it with just carbon. What we've been doing a lot of work on recently is saying, well, actually, we need to incorporate wider greenhouse gases. Agriculture is such an important part of our makeup that we need to reflect that. And so this is a brand new data set that's only just become available. We're doing a lot of work with it at the moment. And as you can see, what we've been able to include in here is agriculture, and predominantly looking in particular at livestock and the crop-related emissions. And as you can see, that's 26%. So our carbon footprint here is obviously bigger, but it's better, it's more reflective and includes all the emissions in the county. Again, what we can't see in here is the negative effect of, the positive effect of taking out carbon through offsetting. And within that, we're doing quite a lot of work, and we're looking at it being between 71,000 tonnes of carbon to around 216,000 based on the newest data sets. We're still calculating that at the moment. And again, this is just another way of showing it. And what I wanted to show here was the kind of below the line bit from agriculture and land use. So the other way we've started looking at carbon emissions is around consumption. So it's looking at, rather than what's produced, what do we buy, what do we use? And what's interesting is this is actually quite a bit smaller. So we were looking at 2,000 kilotons of territorial emissions, where it's around 1,500 from our consumption. So really what that is showing is that actually we consume less carbon than we create because we're a net exporter of goods. In particular, you look at the agricultural sector where we're exporting across the country and elsewhere a lot of food and drink, high quality food and drink, and that's a really key part of our economy. So I just wanted to touch on that. But what this is really helpful for is to help people understand how their behaviours and their consumption affects them on a more personal level, because this is a bit more reflective of a personal carbon footprint. So in terms of key considerations and things for us to consider, like I said, Herefordshire is an exporter of high quality food and drink, and that's something that we're very good at, and it's an opportunity for us to do that more sustainably. We're going through a huge change in farming and how legislation and land management schemes are being funded, so that's a really good opportunity for farmers. It's important to recognise that as a rural county, we've got a big reliance on the car use. Our building stock is predominantly older and more interesting and more historic, but with that comes some challenges, because we've got 30% of our houses which is pre-1919 and about the same which is off the gas grid. So they just require some more innovative retrofit solutions. In terms of opportunities, the retrofit challenge could bring with it a huge economic activity of businesses diversing into retrofit, into new carbon solutions. In Herefordshire, we've been a national leader in anaerobic digestion, and we've got very high levels of solar in the county. And again, trying to meet that challenge of transport, we're looking forward at electrification and how we switch to low carbon vehicles is going to be a really good opportunity for Herefordshire. And in that, we've got an awful lot of best practice. You're going to hear a lot more about that throughout the assembly. And so just one final slide, really, I just wanted to share with you, that's how the county is doing. And this is really how Herefordshire Council is doing. So at the same time as declaring the climate emergency and setting a zero carbon for the county, we've set a zero carbon for the council by 2030. And I just wanted to sort of show you that, we're very much on track to be delivering that. And you can see within this, we've had our 2 carbon management plans. We're currently into our 3rd. We'll be writing our 4th shortly. And we're very much hoping to accelerate and deliver zero before 2030. So I hope that helps to give you a good overview of carbon emissions in Herefordshire. And hopefully that helps you to go forward for the rest of the session. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ben. I hope you've all found that really useful in terms of giving a Herefordshire context to what we're talking about. So as before, we're now going to just take 30 seconds, again, to give you time to reflect on that, note down any key questions you have for Ben. So we'll start that now. Okay, we'll move on now to the final presentation we're going to hear this morning, which is a slightly different topic. So we've now heard our facts about climate change and what the emissions are. So we're now going to think about why it's so difficult to tackle. And we have with us Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who's the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformation, CAST, from the University of Bath. So we'll listen to Lorraine's presentation now.
Hello, my name's Lorraine Whitmarsh. I'm a Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Bath, and I am very happy to be joining you to talk about acting on climate change. So I've got a few slides which I will show you now. Okay. What I'd like to cover in this talk are 3 main points. First of all, I want to talk about why it's difficult to take action on climate change, how some of these difficulties might be overcome, and who has the power to make change happen. So we've known about climate change for a number of years, but we haven't yet made much progress in tackling it. And that's because it is difficult to act on climate change for a number of reasons. I'm going to talk about 2 of these big reasons. The first one is the way our economy and politics work. Our economy has been dependent on fossil fuels, that's coal, oil and gas, for decades, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So the way our factories are powered, the way we heat our homes, the way we travel, most of those things rely on coal, oil and gas. And while we're starting to shift away from that to more renewable sources, we still are quite dependent on fossil fuels to do the things that we need to do and for the energy that we need. Similarly, a lot of the way in which businesses work is that they make money out of getting us to buy more stuff, more physical things, and those things take energy to produce as well. And so a lot of advertising and marketing is encouraging us to buy more, and we're not really encouraged to keep things for longer, to reuse things. But all of this consumption, this buying more stuff, that also produces emissions. And at the moment, there's not really any cost to individuals or to companies to pollute the atmosphere. So we're not penalised if we drive a petrol car, for example, or if we heat our home with gas. We're not paying extra for the pollution that we're causing. And similarly, businesses are not penalised for that. So that's really the economy. And similarly, politics. Well, climate change is a global problem, and all of the countries in the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement. That's a big UN treaty to tackle climate change. So they've agreed we need to take action, but countries are not so far doing as much as they should to tackle climate change. Part of this then is because at the national level, it isn't always a priority. And in the UK, arguably, we should probably be doing more than a lot of other countries because we've been polluting for a longer time, and we are a wealthier country. So we have more that we could invest in tackling climate change. But we have other priorities as well. And similarly, electoral cycles tend to be short term. So governments are only in power for up to 5 years at the most. And so they tend to focus on things that are more short-term issues, things that they can tackle successfully in the course of the time that they're in power. So climate change often is not necessarily a politically an issue that's prioritized politically. But at the same time, it's also about psychological barriers or behavioral barriers to tackling climate change. Humans evolved to focus on things more in the here and now. So it can be difficult for us to really think about sort of global long-term issues like climate change when, well, we often have other things to worry about, you know, going to work, feeding our kids, etc. And similarly, climate change is something we can't directly see ourselves. It's something that we've learnt about through scientific measurement, looking at trends over time in global temperatures, for example. And we hear about that through the media, through the newspapers, TV. And so we might interpret it differently, and you know, to what extent it's a human caused problem or that it's a serious issue. People differ in their views because it's not something that we sort of directly can evaluate ourselves. And so we do debate the issue and there's room for interpretation. Also, as a global problem, individuals might feel there's nothing that they can do about it. And so they sort of think, well, I don't see anybody else doing much. So is there anything that I even as an individual can do? Maybe you feel like sort of a drop in the ocean. And if we don't see anybody else acting, it sort of feels like maybe it's not a normal thing to do. We know we are influenced by what other people do. And if it doesn't seem like a normal thing, we may not think that it's something that we should do. Habits can be a big barrier to doing things differently. So it might just, we often do the things that we just do in the same way every day, and we don't necessarily think about doing things differently. It can be expensive to go green. An electric car, for example, costs a lot more than a petrol car. It can be inconvenient or difficult as well. And so if there isn't a bus service where you live, or there aren't cycle lanes where you live, it can be difficult to move away from car use, for example. Or sometimes we just don't know what is the best thing to do, which is the best product to choose, which is the greener product that has the lower carbon impact. So knowledge can be a gap. So that's a lot of barriers, a lot of difficulties that we can face, but they can be overcome. We know that changing society, and that is what we need to do to tackle climate change, needs action by all of these three groups that you see here on the slide. By government, so that includes the UK government, but also local government, so Herefordshire Council, for example. By businesses, so businesses can change what they do. They can make things in greener ways. They can change the availability and prices of products and services, and individuals and communities, you and I. And that's really a key part of this, actually, because what we know from scientific evidence is that nearly 2/3 of the measures that we need to reach our climate change targets will involve behaviour change, changing the things that we buy, the things that we do, how we travel, how we eat, how we heat our homes, etc. So there's a big role that you and I and communities can play. And these arrows between these groups that you see here are important because we can exert influence on others in this social system. And I want to give you one example here of travel. So if we look over here on the right, we can see that there are lots of things that we as individuals or communities could do if we want to reduce the emissions from travel. We could buy an electric car if we can afford it, or we could switch from driving to taking the bus or walking, for example. We could also, though, write letters to our local councillor, or we could take part in a protest or sign a petition to call for better bus services where we live, or better cycle paths, for example. So we can exert influence on government to make it easier to change our behaviour. Similarly, we are consumers. So when we buy an electric car, for example, we send a signal to businesses to say there is a market here for green products. And so they might start investing in those sorts of things more. And you can see the sorts of things that businesses can do over here. They can provide electric vehicles, or they can provide bike hire services, or they can improve bus services, or whatever it is that they do. They can do things as well to support their staff in changing their behaviour. So they could encourage people to work from home if they can, or have cycle to work schemes. They could also ask the government for support to make it easier for them to take action. So there's an influence that they can have up to government too. And then government up here, you can see they can do a lot. They can implement economic measures like congestion charges, or they can provide subsidies to make electric vehicles cheaper. They could invest in building bicycle lanes, or improving buses and trains, for example, so it's more convenient and attractive to take sustainable travel choices. They can invest in virtual technologies as well, so that maybe we don't even need to travel quite as much. We could have more online meetings as well. So there's lots of things that government can do. And that's summarised here on this slide. So on the left, you see all of the sorts of things that governments can do to help businesses, communities and individuals reduce emissions. They can provide information and advice, so they can put labels on products, for example. They can invest in solutions, so they can spend more on low carbon options. They can tax high carbon options as well, so they become less attractive. And they can change laws and provide regulations, maybe even banning the most polluting options. On the right here, you see the sorts of things businesses can do. They can change what they do and make, and how they make them, so that they are lower carbon, for example. But they can also influence consumer behaviour. They could put labels on products, and they can try and influence government to change the rules. And what can individuals and communities do? As I mentioned, we have to change our behaviour in a number of ways to reduce our carbon footprint, and these are the most effective things that we can do to cut our carbon. So we can give up our car, we can alternatively buy an electric car, we can reduce our flights, we can get renewable electricity, take public transport, and so on. But beyond reducing our own emissions, we can also try and change society. We can influence others. We can speak to our friends and family, just try and talk to people about, what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? Make that sort of action more normal. We can influence others through social media, writing to our councillors or MPs, taking part in a protest or a petition, acting at work, joining a community group, and so on. So altogether then, I've talked about why it's difficult to take action on climate change, partly because of how our economy relies on fossil fuels and people buying more stuff, and partly because our politicians find it difficult to deal with global long-term problems, and because as individuals and communities, we also struggle for lots of reasons. We don't want to think about it, it costs more, it's inconvenient, and so on. We can overcome these difficulties, though, by governments, businesses and individuals acting together to change society. And we as individuals do have power not only to reduce our own carbon footprint, but also to try and change the system, to try and influence others as well. And that's another important way in which we have power. So that's all I wanted to say, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if you have any questions as well from that. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for that presentation. So we'll take our 30 seconds now. Please remember to note down any key questions that you'll be able to ask Lorraine after the break. Okay, so what we're going to do now is move you back into your small groups, and facilitators will explain to you what you need to do when you get there, but we're thinking about the questions which we're going to ask facilitators after the break. So can we move everybody now, Max, please? Thank you. Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you've had a useful discussion in your groups and come up with some good questions for our speakers who'll be joining us after a break. So we're going to go into a 10-minute break now. So we're going to reconvene at, sorry, I've forgotten the time, which is really bad, 11:38. So 10 minutes. You don't need to log off or anything like that. You can just turn your screens off and your cameras off. Keep yourself on mute, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Our question and answer panel. So we're joined by our three excellent speakers. We have Tim Yare from Midlands Energy Hub, we have Lorraine Whitmarsh from the University of Bath, and we have Ben Boswell from Herefordshire Council. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to go to each of your group facilitators, and they're going to put forward your top question from your group. We've got 30 minutes for this session, which is quite generous. So then once we've asked your top question, we'll go back round and ask your second question. So can we start with Lauren, please? And just to say about the mute, if you can remember to keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. But yeah, if we could go to you, Lauren, for your group's first question, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. Lots of layers, but the question is, what is the council's current plan regarding electric car use as a solution, recognising that many of us live rurally and the poor transport links, and importantly, the high costs and any negative impacts of electric cars, such as the cost, the battery disposal, and what the grid can cope with? I think perhaps, Ben, that's something that you might be able to answer for my group.
Thank you, Lauren.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, brilliant. So I suppose a couple of questions in there. So the council's been doing quite a lot of work on electric vehicles for a while, to be honest. And we've got two major pieces of work going on at the moment. So the first is we're working closely with Energy Saving Trusts to develop a new electric vehicle charging strategy, looking at electric vehicles holistically. So really saying up until now, we've put some points in across the county to try and get a network going. And we've been trying to put through planning policy the condition for more to go into new developments. But really what we've tried to look at is, okay, where are we now? Where do we need to get to? How do we get there? And really what are the future needs of Herefordshire likely to be? So we've been doing a lot of work with them on a kind of holistic strategy looking forward. So that's work in development at the moment. So we have to share more on that in the near future. And at the same time, we're also out to tender at the moment for a partner to work with us to massively increase the number of electric charge points across the county. Doing that sort of in partnership with a private organisation. To then we've done a lot of mapping of where we think charge points need to go across the county to sort of meet needs, and what public infrastructure we've got that we can offer to a partner to say, well, you can invest there, and then we can really accelerate the infrastructure. So hopefully that addresses the one part of the question. The other one, I suppose, is around really is it on cost of charge points and or the cars in particular. I mean, the costs of the cars are coming down significantly. I mean, a couple of years ago, we did a big fleet review, and we invested in quite a high number of electric vehicles for the council. And when we looked at that, I think it was around 8,000 miles per year, and it broke even as being well, it turned out to be cheaper than running a traditional vehicle. So I appreciate they can be more expensive to buy new, but the second-hand marketplace is starting to filter with more of them in there now, so that cost will come down. But for us, we invested in our fleet of pool vehicles and service vehicles for hybrids and electrics, and we did that on a cost and carbon basis. So it was really trying to help us to achieve our carbon footprint reductions, but also it's saving money as well. So it's trying to look at it not just at the cost of buying the vehicle, but it's the running costs as well, and they're significantly lower. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ben. And also, just to let everybody know, we are discussing transport in a lot more detail tomorrow morning. Lorraine, I didn't know whether you wanted to say anything in relation to behaviour change and that modal shift to electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that cost is definitely one of the barriers. At the moment, there are some government subsidies to reduce that initial cost. Leasing is another popular option, incidentally, that a lot of people are going for. So you just pay a monthly amount to have an electric car, and then the running costs, as Ben has just said, are much, much lower as well than petrol vehicles. So there are ways of getting them, but at the moment, yes, the infrastructure is starting to develop, the costs are starting to come down. So those barriers are beginning to be removed, but it is a process. And yeah, so I think that is one of the things that's starting to change, but I see Ben wants to come back in.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine. So it's funny how some people can do it and others can't.
Brilliant, yeah, and just to build on that, one thing I forgot to mention, actually, we've got a project live at the moment where we're working with a number of communities across the county to set up new car clubs, and as part of that we're funding electric vehicles as part of that, so that people can then join a car club in a locality and have access to an electric car in that way, as well as a different way of, well, it's a better potential way to use cars, but also to give people the opportunity to use them. So I can share some more info on that separately if that would help.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ben. I think we'll move to the second group's question now. So we were going to go to Paul's group next. Paul, do you have your priority question from your group, please?
Yeah, this is also a question for Ben. As part of your presentation, you showed a graph which indicated the reduction so far in Herefordshire, what we've already done. Could you say a little bit more about what caused that reduction, so we can maybe harvest what's already working, and if there's time, is offsetting a con?
So I suppose in terms of how it's come down, it's a huge variety of actions across all the sectors, really. So lots of work on sustainable active transport modes, lots of building retrofit. So it's really, I suppose, it's really trying to look at each of the sections in turn. And I've kind of done a short overview for each of the sessions later. But really, if you look at buildings, it's around trying to get more energy efficiency measures in, which is very key. So we've been running a lot of grant schemes and support. There's been national schemes as well. So with insulation, looking at lighting, the council themselves, we've invested heavily in a large number. So I suppose one project that we did a few years back was looking at all the public lighting in the county. So we changed all of the street lights to LED, and that gave us a sort of 75% reduction in energy consumption there. So it's a lot of projects like that. Also, I suppose with businesses have had a big push as energy prices have gone up to try and reduce that and save money. So we've run a lot of schemes, and it's not just about what the council is running. This is, lots of businesses, organisations, individuals taking action as well. And on top of that, to be honest, I think what showed in one of Tim's graphs is, the electricity, the intensity of carbon in electricity is coming down nationally as well, and so that is having an effect on all of the consumption across the county as well. So it's around the behaviours we as individuals have, how we're using resources better, investing in reducing our demand, and then nationally it's that implication of energy intensity of carbon coming down as well. So I don't know if that helps. You mentioned on offsetting as a con. I think offsetting's got it's got a place within the overall strategy, and I think what we're approaching, we've targeted net zero in Herefordshire, and our approach there is to sort of look at our balance of how we can have I suppose it's going to be some emissions from some things we do, and it's then trying to have an offsetting or a sequestering that carbon to then balance it, so we have a net impact on the atmosphere. And our approach is very much adopting a hierarchy that's very much around, reducing the need to use the consumption, then using it more, getting that as efficient as possible, then looking at sustainable sources of energy, and then if we can't do anything and we do have some residual emissions, is then how do we offset that? So I do think it has a place, but for us it's that hierarchy in a similar way that we address waste. It's around, reduce, reuse, recycle in that kind of order.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I don't know whether you wanted to say anything more about offsetting specifically, just in terms of what we mean when we talk about offsetting. And Tim, you may want to contribute to this as well. But if you could give a kind of short explanation of offsetting. Oh, sorry. I could do with this in my own house, this facility.
Sorry, I shouldn't mute myself again. So in terms of offsetting, it's around the various different ways of taking, well, either sequestering carbon, which is where carbon is taken out through natural processes, or even industrial processes, where carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and how that's recorded. And then in terms of offsetting, it would then be investing in projects that do that elsewhere. So if you're not able to do that yourself, you might invest in another project locally, or even the purchasing of energy that is zero carbon. So for example, the council, we buy all of our electricity from renewable energy backed sources, so we can go back and say this is coming specifically from renewable energy as its origin. So really that's the general sort of term for it. I don't know if Tim wants to jump in.
I think you've summed it up pretty well there. I mean, there are numerous different ways of offsetting. I think we have to be very aware of ensuring we don't greenwash some of the offsets. I mean, that's something which is often thrown out as one of the criticisms, but we have to make sure that we are very transparent when we say something is being offset. We just need to be clear about how we're offsetting it, and make sure that we have got all of the certificates that come with green electricity, for instance, all lined up, so we know exactly where and how it has been offset. We can't then therefore be criticised for using that. I do see offsetting as the last resort. We should be trying to do as much as we can to reduce our emissions, first of all, through a number of different energy efficiency or efficiency schemes, and then offsetting really is a last resort if we can't do it by any other means. We will need some elements of offsetting or sequestration, but yeah, we need to be better with the use of energy first.
That's great, thank you, Tim. Okay, we'll move on to Vicky's group.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, yes, sorry, your mic, we're getting a bit of feedback off your mic, a bit echoey. Okay, we'll move on to Vicky's group. Vicky, did you have your kind of priority question?
Yes, my question, our question is for Tim, and is 1.5% only achievable if all countries are involved, and by extension, I suppose, in the UK, all counties involved? I've added that bit, I have to say, sorry, group, but it's yeah, that's the question.
Yes, is the answer. It's not something that one country or one county can actually do anything about on their own. It's got to be something which is a global effort to tackle. I mean, according to the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, 1.5 is still possible, but only if everybody does their bit. There's no other way we'll be able to achieve it.
That's great, thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. Okay, Kath, can we come to your priority question next, please?
Yes, sorry, I've had to pick that based on the answers we've had for previous questions. So
okay, great.
I hope
thanks.
I'm representing my group sufficiently. There was a question about the national and regional categories on the statistics that made it quite difficult to compare. So can we compare our progress in Herefordshire with other similar rural counties so we can compare like with like? And in addition to that, can you clarify what research is available for assessing behaviour change?
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Kath. We'll start with comparisons first and go to you, Ben, if that's okay. Oh, Ben, sorry, you seem to be on. We can't hear you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tim may want to jump in as well, to be honest, because we've done quite a lot of work together on all the data sets. So in terms of, when I went through my presentation, I went through 3 different data sets. So the one, which is the one we've been using for an awfully long time, is, yeah, we can get data sets for all of the local authority areas in the country, and we can look at that, so we can compare, you know, by types of local authorities and nearest neighbours. I think I picked a few of our local ones. I think I picked, was it Shropshire and Worcestershire, just to give an example. But I could do a graph that shows how we sit across all sort of shire counties or sort of unitary counties. Also, we could look at I suppose others who might look at Cornwall, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, and others that are quite similar. So I could do something like that if that would be helpful. We also look at it in terms of per capita emissions as well, noting that not everyone has the same level of population. So there is data available in those data sets to say how do we look at what's our carbon emission per person. And at the moment for Herefordshire, I think it's 5.2 tonnes per person is the split of our total emissions by population. So that, again, that's another way of comparing it. So yeah, if it would be helpful, I could do a one-pager to circulate.
Yes, please. I think that would be very helpful. And then we can either email that out to people. Well, we'll do both. We'll email it out and put it on Basecamp. Thank you, Ben. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before we move on to Lorraine?
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite important to compare progress against yourself, but also against comparable types of local authorities. There's no point really comparing ourselves to Birmingham, but comparing ourselves to Lincolnshire with a similar sort of demographic is sometimes quite a useful thing to do. We should never use those as a be-all and end-all. No, we are quite, Herefordshire is Herefordshire, and we should really see how we are progressing against ourselves. Everybody has a role to play, but I think it's important to see how we are progressing against ourselves, which is why Herefordshire has used the same sort of data set for nearly 20 years, I guess, because it does show comparability over time. And I think that's quite an important thing to do. It's why we tend to keep the same data set, so we don't start changing the data that we're showing and comparing different footprints. That's got inherent errors which can occur. So we just need to be careful about the data that we do compare and make sure that we are comparing like for like. But it is sometimes useful to see where we are compared to Shropshire. But a league table as such is not necessarily the best way to go, I think.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Tim. Kath, can I just come back to you about the second part of your question on behaviour change, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. It was about what research is available for assessing behaviour change, because we've looked at the statistics for sort of outcome and monitoring it, but that's about overall statistics. So this was about assessing actual behaviour change. What research is available for people to see on that?
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Kath.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a large evidence base on, first of all, how much of the measures needed to get to net zero will involve behaviour change. So, for example, the UK Committee on Climate Change has estimated that it's something like about 60% or so of the measures needed to reach our carbon targets will involve some degree of behaviour change. So there's that sort of evidence that comes from models and things where they figure out, all of the sorts of things that are needed and what slice of that is behavioural. Then there's another set of evidence which looks at what works to actually change behaviour and, the extent to which, for example, giving people information, putting labels on products, information campaigns versus incentives and taxes and subsidies and all sorts of things versus regulations and other sorts of measures work to change behaviour. And for example, they show that usually informational type approaches are about 2 to 3% effective. And the more you move up through sort of economic measures through to sort of regulatory and tougher things, the more you get bigger shifts in behaviour. But broadly speaking, the more of these measures that you combine, the bigger effect on behaviour change. So there's a huge sort of academic and policy actually literature that shows, how these things work. And they use all sorts of indicators from surveys that ask people before and after, what are you doing? Which is not the best type of measure because everybody likes to say they're quite green, through to much more sort of objective measures really of behaviour that where you might be weighing the amount of waste people produce before and after an intervention, or looking at their energy meters, or counting the numbers of cars on the road, or depending on specific behaviours that you're looking at. So there's a whole range of different measures that you might use to evaluate them, but they're all sort of captured in these different reports and papers. If needs be, I can kind of send through 1 or 2 links to example papers if that's helpful.
Yes, please. That would be great. Thank you, Lorraine. Okay, John, I'm aware you've got your hand up, but I want to go to our last group just so that we've given all groups equal chance to put their question forward. Thank you for using the raise hand function, by the way, that's great. And we'll come to you after we've covered the question from the last group. So Mary, do you have your priority question, please? Have we got Mary? No, is there somebody from Mary's group here that would like to ask the question?
Thank you, thank you. I thought I was lost in the ether there.
So did I for a minute.
Okay, this question is related to behaviour change and Lorraine specifically. It's about how do we make it affordable for individuals to make behavioural changes, and what sort of incentives would assist with this?
Great, thank you, Mary.
So what are the incentives? And I'm so sorry, what was the second half?
So it's basically how do we make it affordable for individuals to make those lifestyle changes that are required, and what sort of incentives would assist with this?
Okay, brilliant. We touched on one example already in terms of electric vehicles, and so the government has a couple of incentives there to reduce the initial cost of the vehicle, and then you get there's another little economic incentive, a reduction in how much you pay to get a charger fitted in your home, for example. So those are examples of subsidies for encouraging people to get electric vehicles. Similarly, they're going to do the same, I think, for heat pumps to reduce the cost of that technology. So those are the sorts of economic measures that are starting to come through to reduce the cost of those technologies. And at the moment, those technologies are still a little bit more expensive than or sometimes a lot more expensive than the higher carbon alternatives. But what happens over time is that the more those technologies develop, the more people will buy them, the cost comes down as well. So you don't necessarily need to keep those subsidies in place for forever. Just it's only until the cost of those things come down. So, but those are examples of a couple of the things that are happening at the moment. Public transport is subsidised to different extents in different areas. So, you know, already buses, for example, and maybe trains in some places are cheaper than they would be without those subsidies. So there's lots of those sorts of things that help to reduce the cost of lower carbon options for people. And I think we need more of those, because still quite often that the high carbon alternative is still sometimes more cheaper. So we do need more of that. Yeah. Did that answer the question fully?
Yes, we had covered electric vehicles quite a lot in our group, and that was the example that came up. I was wondering, are there any other examples that aren't necessarily sort of big capital investments, so normal sort of day-to-day behavioural change?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, using sort of, I mentioned public transport. I guess one of the other examples might be the sort of cycle to work scheme as well. So some employers offer, I think how it works is, hopefully maybe colleagues in the council know more about this, but I think employers allow you to have tax-free bikes or something, and then you pay it back through your salary. Is that right? And so there's other things like that. And I'm struggling for other examples. Ben's got lots, I'm sure.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Lorraine. Can we come to you, Ben? Sorry.
Yeah, do you want to jump in? I mean, a couple of others that come to mind. You mentioned cycle to work scheme. That's a key one. That's one we introduced, and we've had brilliant success in getting loads of people cycling with that. You mentioned public transport. At the moment, Herefordshire offers free public transport in the weekends. Again, that's another one. And another local example, again, transport, is the barrel bike scheme, which has been a tremendous success, that was introduced, and that's got a small level of subsidy to keep the costs down as well. So those are sort of some day-to-day ones. Another one, sort of looking at, I suppose it's capital. Renewable energy was a big one. If you look at the feed-in tariffs and solar panels, for example, they started out about £16,000 to install a solar system on a house. That's now down to about 4, and that's through the intervention that came in through feed-in tariffs and grants. And then, as you say, that very much changes the marketplace. Lots more people bought it, lots more businesses diversified. The cost of producing, installing came down, and so it's now a quarter of the cost that it used to be, and there's a lot more mainstream. So I suppose that's just another couple of examples to add in.
Okay, That's great. Thank you, Ben. So I'm just conscious of time, but we've got about 6 minutes left for this session. I'd like to open up questions now to the floor. So you'll notice John raised a hand, and so then he comes directly up to my top left-hand corner of my screen, so I can see that he wants to ask a question. So please do use that raise hand function. John, you've put your hand down. Has your question been covered?
So the question is, Lorraine did mention that there's a scheme where you can lease electric vehicles rather than having to buy them if you can't afford it. Obviously, that's not going to be an option because they are quite high in price. So just wondering, is Herefordshire running a scheme like this where we can lease electric vehicles?
Thank you, PJ. Ben, do you could you answer that, please?
I think there's two parts to that. I think one of them is going to be through private lease schemes that offer them as leases, which is what I think Lorraine was referring to. But then there is that other example I mentioned where we are working with car clubs to set up local schemes that people can join and have shared access to vehicles, and through that we are putting some match funding in to help them get electric vehicles for exactly that. So you can have sort of community access to electric vehicles. So again, I can share some information on that. It's kind of work in progress at the moment, but I can tell you where they're evolving.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben. Is that okay, PJ? I just want to go over to John, because I think, John, you're off mute now and you were waiting very patiently for a long time.
So I had difficulty unmuting when you asked me to.
Don't worry.
Two quick questions. One is to Tim and Ben. They've been doing these comparisons on trends between similar councils. Have they found any other area or county that's doing something we're not, that is effective? And the second question was for Lorraine, which was, I think it was in Ben's presentation, he put up a list of legislation the current government has put through in about the last 12 months. And I just wondered, as her being a professor and an external thing, it surprised me how much there was. Is any of it going to be any good and have a likely positive impact, or is it just camouflaged by the government?
Thank you, John. We've just got a couple of minutes left, but Tim, if I could come to you for the first part of the question, then we'll go to Lorraine. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples across the UK. Herefordshire is not alone in this. Some good examples are around the Cotswolds areas, where I think Rachel has actually spoken to you on Thursday. She's done a lot of work around that sort of part of the country. Cornwall as well, another very rural county, they've done a lot of work down there. So we're not absolute pioneers in this. I'd actually say Herefordshire and the Marches region in general is actually not doing too badly. But we can still learn from other areas. That I can certainly put you in touch with other councils across England in particular.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Tim.
I think Ben's got a follow-up to
that. Okay, Ben, very quickly, because I'd like to just take the second.
Yeah, sorry,
part
it was only if there was time. Just to say, we do quite a lot of work with other local authorities looking at best practice and benchmarking. And I'm really pleased to say there was a benchmarking exercise took place at the end of last year. The results were announced on Thursday, and Herefordshire came out top in the West Midlands. But what is in that is there's still a lot of areas for us to improve on, and so actually working very closely with all those local authorities at some of the best practice they've got and how we can bring that here.
Okay, thank you. Lorraine, did you need a reminder of the second part of the question? Because I've certainly forgotten it.
No, well, I do. So yes, it's clear. So basically, is the legislation, I think, that Ben referred to, is it any good? I mean, I think I don't remember all the ones that he had on the slide, to be honest, but I imagine if it's the net zero strategy, the Department for Transport's decarbonising transport strategy, and so there have been various kind of bits of legislation and policy and so on coming out in the last sort of few months, and they're definitely making big steps in the right direction. Personally, I think they need to go further, and I think the Committee on Climate Change said something similar in their assessment of the UK's net zero strategy that came out in the autumn, that it's a really big step forward, but they've missed out on a few areas. For example, they haven't really covered aviation adequately. They've not they've not really got very much at all on behaviour change, which is the area that I work in and which is huge. So there are gaps, I would say, but it's not bad. It's just it's not quite as ambitious as it needs to be.
Okay, that's great. And I'm really sorry, everybody, but that is all we have time for the Q&A. So I'm aware Richard, Peter and Richard B, you've got raised hands, and Dom too. And I know, Kit, you had your hand up at one stage too. If you could let your facilitators know your questions, we will ensure that you receive an answer. And as Claire has written in the chat, all unanswered questions will be answered. So we'll send answers to those round via email and on Basecamp. Okay, so if I could just thank our three speakers, Tim, Lorraine and Ben, thank you very much for excellent presentations and for taking part in this Q&A. Very, very good. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Claire now, who's going to introduce the next session.
Okay, thanks for that. We're now going to put you back into your small breakout rooms with your facilitators, and we're going to give you about half an hour just to try and digest, reflect, discuss and come up with some kind of what are the key messages that you've taken from everything we've heard so far. So that take your mind back to Thursday evening as well, and obviously the presentations that you've heard today as well. So facilitators will take you through an exercise and we'll see you in about half an hour. Hi everybody and welcome back. So very shortly we're going to be allowing you time off for good behaviour. So we're going to be giving you an hour off for your lunch. But before we do that, we just wanted to share with you a short video by somebody called George the Poet, which we think sums up what we're trying to achieve through the Assembly.
A paradigm shift is a change in common sense. But how do you go about rearranging common sense? Especially with years of research and journalism making the conversation long and dense. Well, sense isn't something to try and enforce. It should be kind of endorsed by a reliable source. And in the case of climate change, a good place to start would be science, of course. Now, you remember science from school, an essential subject. Well, let's consider it standing in the general public. Our scientists are in a position to advise us on some of our biggest decisions. And it's probably in our interest to listen, but also to invite others to witness the vision. The first way to do that is to be the vision. Through your lifestyle choices, you can lead the mission. Bring the future to your present when it seems a bit distant. The cleanest existence is green and efficient. And you haven't really played your part until your lifestyle reflects a change of heart. It's a continuous process. I'm still working on it myself, but technology plays a major part. I'm trying to play my part as an artist, but all I do is write verses and harmonize melodies. Now, the point of us working together on this is that one of you knows how to decarbonize energy. So if you could consider that when making your plans, I'm happy to leave it in your capable hands. This is the solution government can't offer: ground level collaboration. Doesn't it sound better than having patience? Instead of sleepwalking into the governance trap, using our imagination to take initiative as a nation, which involves looking at our economic ambitions to ensure that, as well as earning ourselves more and banking ourselves more, we're actually doing things we're thanking ourselves for in the long run. Because a lucrative plan is a smart one, but a sustainable plan is a strong one.
Okay, so we're going to be taking an hour off for lunch now. Just before we go, I just want to say thank you so much to all our speakers that have joined us this morning. We will be back promptly at 1:45 to start again. If you can join us from 1:40, that will be great, just so we're ready to get going. When you come back, you'll notice you've been put back in the waiting room, but you don't need to do anything. We will just readmit you, but your screen might just look a bit differently. That's all. So enjoy some lunch. If you can grab 5 minutes of fresh air. It's a beautifully sunny day here in Shropshire. I hope it is in Herefordshire. Grab some lunch and we look forward to seeing you back at 1:45. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're bang on 1:45. So we're going to make a start. Just to let you know, we've got one change in our support team this afternoon. So Natalia Silva isn't with us this afternoon. We're joined instead by Colette Sutton. Colette, can you give a wave, please, if you're on camera? I can't actually see you on my screen. So Colette is here to represent Herefordshire Council. So if we've got any council specific questions, then Colette will be able to answer those. But we're also joined by Ben Boswell again as well, who's also able to do that. So we're going to spend the rest of the day looking at the first of our themes of buildings. So these are, when we say buildings, we're talking about our homes that we live in, but also other public buildings. So we want to try to give you a bit more detail on this theme, and we're going to hear from 7 speakers in total. So the first set of 3 speakers, we'll be looking at existing buildings and how we can reduce emissions in existing buildings, partly through retrofit, but also looking at heat as well and how we heat our homes and other buildings. And then the second group of presentations is more focused on new buildings and regulations and that type of thing that need to be put in place to try to reduce emissions through any new buildings. So before we do that, we're going to hear a very short introduction from Ben Boswell, who you've already met this morning. And Ben's going to do this at the start of each of our themes of housing, transport and land use. And it's just really to put the theme in context within Herefordshire. So he's going to tell us what we know about buildings emissions in Herefordshire. So if you could start that video, please, Max.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Boswell, and I'm here today to give you a short overview of buildings emissions in Herefordshire. As you'll see, when you look at our carbon footprint in its entirety, there's a staggering amount of emissions coming from building stock. What we want to do is break that down. So within the housing sector, there's 21% of all of our emissions coming from the sort of electricity we use within the home, and then heating fuels, which are predominantly gas and oil. What you'll see is oil is 9% on its own in Herefordshire, which is a really high percentage nationally. And that's really because we've got quite a lot of unique and off-gas grid homes requiring a different heating solution. If you then combine that with the industry and commerce emissions, we estimate that 13% of total emissions come from buildings in those sectors where you're using space heating electricity as opposed to industrial process energy use. Another way of looking at it is rather looking at the emissions from what we use, it's around the emissions from what we consume. And that way, it's a slightly different way of looking at it, but it's quite important because if you look at the average carbon footprint of residents, 27% of all our emissions come from how we heat and use our homes. So it's a really key area for us to look at as individuals to try and help reduce our carbon footprint. To give a bit of a flavour of the challenge and the housing stock we've currently got about 87,000 homes in Herefordshire, and that's really a good mix of properties, but predominantly detached and semi-detached homes, which are slightly larger. As you'll see, we've got about a third of our housing stock that was built before 1919, and so those older buildings are generally harder to heat and require innovative solutions to retrofit. We've got just over a third of our homes that are off the gas grid. So again, what that means is a high reliance on solid fuels and oil and alternative heating systems. When you look at our non-domestic sector, so that's really looking at industrial units, public buildings, hospitals, libraries, schools. We've got about 12,000 of those. And generally, those are of a slightly higher standard than the domestic sector. And that's really because a lot of businesses invest in energy efficiency to try and improve their bottom line. So generally, they're slightly better than the domestic sector, but still a big challenge for us to retrofit. And just, I suppose, a final slide, just to say that, of our housing stock, the average rating of energy performance certificates, which is what you would have to produce if you were to sell your home, is an E, which is, a lot of room for improvement. We have high levels of fuel poverty as a result of our housing stock being hard to heat and expensive to heat. For us, there's a real focus on solid wall, listed and alternate fuel heating systems. And really in the non-domestic sector, I'm pleased to say we've got a lot of really good best practice. You'll hear a bit more about that today as you go through. And just to finish, the housing sector is more than just a carbon challenge. It's a really exciting opportunity for us in our local economy to really create new jobs, retrofitting, and really building a sustainable economy. So I hope that helps to set the scene, and over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Ben. And Ben's going to be joining us for the first Q&A. So we'll take our 30 seconds now just to allow you time to write down any questions that you may have for Ben or any thoughts on that presentation at all. Okay, sorry, I almost went over the 30 seconds then. So we're going to move into our first presentation about retrofit now. And this is from Jonathan Atkinson, who's a project manager at an organisation called the Carbon Co-op, who are based in Manchester. And Jonathan's going to tell us about the approach that they've been taking to retrofit in Manchester. Thanks, Max.
Hi there, my name is Jonathan Atkinson. I'm really delighted to be joining you today to talk about retrofit and to share some of our experiences around local opportunities and challenges. So this is what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about, well, I'm going to firstly introduce some of our work very briefly to give you a bit of a context where I'm talking from. Then I'm going to talk about building local skills and strengthening local economies and the role retrofit might play there. We'll talk about some of the challenges for getting retrofit going, and then talk about some of the enablers, which hopefully end on a bit of a positive note. So just very quickly, Carbon Co-op, we're a community energy organisation, not for profit, and our main aim is to help people and communities make the changes they need to tackle the threat of climate change. That's what we're motivated by. We're a member-driven organisation, and we have members from all over Greater Manchester, but increasingly from all over the country. Most of our work is in Manchester, Greater Manchester area. We take a certain approach to retrofit in common with some of the other speakers today. Retrofit, retrospectively fitting energy efficiency improvements to a home, to an existing home. Also, that includes small-scale renewables and smart systems as well. We take a fabric-first approach, so the focus is on improving the fabric of the building to reduce demand, then to think about other things like solar panels and heat pumps. We take a whole house approach. That means not necessarily doing everything in one big go, but thinking about the changes that a house needs to undergo to bring it to some of the climate change targets we know are needed. Having that whole house approach in mind, potentially going in stages to reach that, but thinking about the whole house so you don't have to do things and then redo them later on. We favour low impact materials with high sustainability, such as wood fibre, and taking an all-round approach to sustainability. We're also open source, so we publish our tools in an open source license that other people can use. And we work within 2035, which is the government's process standard in this area for retrofit. People-powered retrofit is an initiative that came around 2-3 years ago now, out of the work that Carbon Co-op had been doing. We realized that people got so far in their retrofit journey and then were stuck. And people-powered retrofit is now an independent social enterprise that takes people from the start of their journey, from just thinking about retrofit, all the way through to getting the works done. Yeah, it's a fee earning service, so we charge people for that service. And yeah, we're just expanding at the moment, and things are really taking off. We work mostly in Greater Manchester, but we do collaborate with other organisations around the UK to help them do similar stuff. Okay, so that's a bit about us and our experience. I'm going to think about now building local skills and developing a local economy for retrofit. When we think about retrofit, sometimes we just think there's a householder involved and there's a contractor, and the householder just needs to speak to the contractor and get it all sorted. Actually, as you can see from this diagram, and I'm not going to go into every single role, but there are many and various different people involved in this process. from contractors to subcontractors, building control, local authorities, builders, merchants, all sorts of people. The point I'm trying to make here is there are a lot of people behind making a retrofit happen, and that means there are lots of potential job opportunities involved. This slide shows you the job roles that we employ in people-powered retrofit. And again, it just shows you the real diversity of different types of roles, you know, some managerial, some at a different level. We work with coordinators, assessors, managers, architects, engineers, contractors. So there's loads of people that go into this process, and it's a huge employment opportunity for retrofit, really. How have we gone about developing local skills in our area, and what would we share? What are the lessons we would share? What we would say is that it's really important to work with existing contractor networks. These are people already active in local areas, in homes. They are commonly termed the repair, maintenance and improvement sector, RMI. And that's everything from new kitchens and bathrooms to extensions, all sorts of things. These people are already active at our local level, already getting stuff done. And we'd advocate working with those people first. It's important to engage with them and respect them, and to give them the training and opportunity they need, focusing on on-site training and peer learning. So you're encouraging people to develop skills within their local areas that they can share and all develop together, rather than trying to bring in something from outside. So it's a huge opportunity for local economic development and local businesses that are already active. What are the challenges out there? Because we know there are challenges to this happening. One thing a point I would make is that previous approaches that have been government-led haven't respected the local existing contractor supply chains and have relied on big companies. So big companies can come in here, regenerate this area and bring jobs. Actually, it's not worked, because it's very rarely that a householder would say, I'll ring up Carillion to fix my boiler. You know, it's more trusted local companies, and that's been one of the mistakes in the past, to go big. Retrofit isn't happening because it isn't normal. It's not the sort of thing many people have done. It's a relatively niche kind of service, and you may not know any friends and neighbours who've had it done. When householders do get involved, they have trouble finding the appropriate technical expertise. They have worries about who to trust to get this expertise, and there are difficulties in making choices and decisions. You know, what do I do first? Who do I work with? And finding the contractors as well. So what kind of enablers might we put in place that could help overcome these challenges and help unlock these local economic possibilities? I'm going to go through three. One of them is to work with the willing. If we think about the rollout of new technologies, we can often segment it into these kind of rough kind of segments. You have the innovators and early adopters, then you have the majority, then you have the laggards. The rollout of mobile phones is a really good example of this. You had people getting on board really early, using the phones, which were big and clunky and expensive. They innovated the market so that the early majority could then get involved later, when there were more mature business models and technical and the technical standards were up to date. What we would advocate is working with these people, and we can talk about what types of people they are, but working with the people that are willing to do this retrofit work, so you're starting to speed the market that way. When we talk to the early adopters, their motivations are very different to what some policymakers assume is the way that things are. Reducing bills is an important part of that, but actually for early adopters, there are things like making the house warmer and more comfortable and reducing carbon emissions. Actually, the people willing to go early have these kind of motivations. So let's work with them first. And market research that we've done suggests that a number of them have decent budgets. They have money there ready and willing to spend in the kind of £20,000 to £50,000 mark. So let's work with them, untap that existing finance, and we don't need to bring in finance from outside. We can get things going right away. I'd say community-based action is also really key to making this happen. People-powered retrofit is really rooted in our community. We run education and awareness sessions, really participatory. We have home energy parties. We have a really bright and strong local presence here. There are many other similar local organisations around the UK, in Herefordshire and beyond. And we think we should be working with these people because they're inherently more trusted than these bigger organisations that come from outside. The third enabler is service design. It's really important that retrofit as a process, as a thing, works for the people involved. We spent a lot of time in People Powered Retrofit working with and talking to householders and other stakeholders in this process, understanding what works for them, understanding their priorities and their needs. Unless we do that, unless we focus in on what people want, we're going to design things that don't work for anyone, like some of the past examples. Okay, some lessons just to round up. In our opinion, retrofit, building a retrofit market, one size doesn't fit all. We need to be focused and targeted to what works in Herefordshire and what works for the people who want to retrofit their homes. We work with them first, we can expand the market for others. But at the moment, with such a small scale, we need to be focused and targeted. It's important to be really client focused and really client oriented, to test and to pilot and to start things small, but start things. To build technical expertise and capacity, and there is some fantastic technical expertise in Herefordshire, which is a great thing, but we need to build that, and to be collaborative and open and work with others. Okay, so that's it for me, talking about the local opportunities and challenges, gone over our work, we've talked about the opportunities, talked about the possibilities for local economic development, and we've talked about the enablers. So yeah, I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now, sadly, Jonathan isn't able to join us for the Q&A, but Gervais Manguana, who's the final speaker we will hear from in this set of presentations, is going to be covering for Jonathan because he also works for the Carbon Co-op. But we'll take our 30 seconds now just to give you the opportunity to note down key thoughts and questions. Okay, so moving on to our second presentation. This is from Dr. Richard Lowes from the UK Energy Research Centre at the University of Exeter. And Richard's going to be talking to us about alternatives to heating our homes. Thank you, Max.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Richard Lowes, and I'm a specialist in the technologies and policies associated with sustainable heating. I started my career working in the gas industry and have since worked for the University of Exeter. And currently I'm primarily employed by an organisation called the Regulatory Assistance Project, which is a think tank which aims to help policymakers with the energy transition. And I lead the European team's work on sustainable heating. I've got a few slides for you that I'll just share with you now. Okay, so in that picture, I'm stood next to a large heat pump by some solar panels, and that's heating a school in the Isles of Scilly off the Cornish coast, not too far from me. And really, that's a good example of where lots of homes and buildings in the UK need to get to. We need to be using a lot more electricity for our heating because we can make that from renewables. And I'll just spend a few minutes now talking about the key technologies which we can use to help get us there. So the first thing to say is that the importance of electricity for the future of heating can't really be understated. And the term electrify everything is used quite frequently in these sorts of debates. Currently, the UK has a lot of gas and oil heating. Most homes are connected to the gas grid, and many of those which aren't connected to the gas grid, many of those in Herefordshire, for example, have oil heating, although a significant proportion do also have some electric heating too. Electrifying the heat that we use in our homes and buildings has really been seen as a key approach to how we get to sustainable heating and how we take the carbon emissions out of our heating for well over a decade. It's a relatively simple idea. We now know how we can produce renewable electricity, and we can use that electricity and turn it into heat. It's not quite that simple, but that's the fundamentals. And this picture here is my sister-in-law, Jo, on a family trip to an offshore wind farm just off the coast of Brighton in Sussex. And I think what what we learned as a family and just seeing it in practice is the sheer scale of these things, but also you get an idea of just how much energy they can produce. And the fantastic thing is that we've known and we've seen the costs of these renewables coming down significantly now. And actually, when we look at the current prices of fossil fuels and the market price of electricity, it's now a fact that renewable energy is driving down the costs of electricity and actually undercutting fossil fuels. However, it's important to remember that actually making this transition away from fossil fuels to low carbon heating will cost something, certainly in terms of an upfront capital cost, although it will pay back over time. And as I've said already, we're already seeing the electricity that we use in the UK become increasingly green. So heat pumps are widely seen as a really vital technology in the transition to sustainable heating. This isn't just in the UK, but this is around the world as well. And they're devices that extract energy in the form of heat from the environment. And so an air source heat pump like the one pictured uses electricity to move heat from the air into a house. It basically takes all of the energy in the air and it effectively compresses it and puts it into a usable temperature, which you can put into your house. Ground source heat pumps do something very similar, but they extract the heat from the ground and again compress that heat. And water source heat pumps extract heat from water sources such as rivers, lakes, and the sea. And there's energy down in these sources down to very, very low temperatures. It's just a matter of having to use a bit more energy to squeeze it out. But it's fair to say that heat pumps work in negative temperatures, and actually they're very popular in some Scandinavian countries. Obviously, you need some energy to make the heat pumps work, and I've mentioned already that will be likely coming from green electricity, and that electricity basically drives the process to pull the heat out. But the big value of heat pumps is that you use around a unit of electricity, but you actually end up getting about 3 or 4 units of heat out. So they've got this very, very important system efficiency, which means it's a much more efficient and sustainable way of using heating compared to, for example, just an electric immersion heater like you have in a kettle. The technology itself is used at scale around the world, and it has some very similar components to refrigeration technology. It's indeed very, very similar to air conditioning, and very much just air conditioning systems in reverse. The difference between heat pumps and boilers is they work at, heat pumps work at a lower temperature than a gas boiler in general. So that the heat pump that's heating this house behind me, the maximum flow temperature is 45 degrees, and that keeps my house nice and toasty because we've designed the radiators to be like that. But often with gas and oil boiler systems, you tend to run your temperatures at, your radiators at higher temperatures, maybe 70 degrees or so. Any hotter than that's getting a bit too hot. But it takes some getting used to, and it does often mean that you might need bigger radiators if you're switching to a heat pump, possibly even bigger pipe work in your house, although not always. Another thing to bear in mind is that for heat pump systems, unlike a gas combi boiler, you do need to have a hot water tank. And this doesn't affect all homes, but it might affect some of the smaller homes. And there are other technologies that could play a role in sustainable heating too. So one of the, I guess, competing technologies with heat pumps are heat network systems. There's an image of one on the right-hand side here. And basically, in these systems, you have a number of homes connected to a network, and that network is distributing hot water rather than gas or electricity. And you'd have an energy center which produces the energy in one place. These tend to be associated with more urban areas because the density of houses means that they're cheaper to install because you have to have less pipe, for example, per house. Although there are examples where they could be used in more rural areas, for example, if households wanted to get together and save some money on their renewable heating system. There are also things like storage heaters. Modern ones are a lot better than they used to be and a lot more controllable and producing heat at the right time of the day. And also, if you're in an extremely efficient house, actually, it might not be that a heat pump's necessary. You can just get away with something like a simple electric radiator. And while that might be a bit more expensive to run, it might be very cheap to install. And the other thing just to say is that actually with an increasingly, I guess, complicated and renewable energy system, There is also benefits in terms of smart metering and having your heating on and off at certain times of the day. And that means that actually you can integrate more flexible renewable energy into the system. So it doesn't necessarily matter that the sun's not shining when your heating's on, because possibly you can store it. But there are smart tariffs through some energy companies that basically allow you to get cheaper rates at certain times of the day. And what that means is that overall your heating bill can be reduced. So the UK is actually in quite a poor position when it comes to sustainable heating and heat pumps in general. And what this graph shows is the number of heat pumps sold per 1,000 households in 2018. And what you can see is that the UK, and this is 2018, but not a huge amount has changed in there, the UK really is at the bottom of all of these European countries. And other countries are making a lot more progress, particularly Scandinavian countries, where the heat pump market is particularly strong. And this story was actually featured in the newspapers not that long ago, with the headline here, "Fewer heat pumps are sold and installed in the UK than almost any other country in Europe." And this is a real shame. The technologies already exist. I've got one in my house. Thousands are installed in the UK every year, although the numbers are quite low. And they keep people's homes warm, and they're also very climate friendly. They do remove the emissions from heating. But hard work is still needed to get the number of heat pumps that we need to have installed to meet our carbon targets. It will take a lot of work and some money to get there. And that includes not just the heat pump systems themselves, but possibly additional energy efficiency measures in people's homes, be that new windows or insulated walls. But as well as that, because we're moving away from a gas-based system to a more electricity-based system, this also implies that we need to invest a lot more in electricity, in terms of electricity generation and in terms of the actual electricity infrastructure that gets the energy to our homes in the first place. And we also need to decide how this is paid for. And this is a really interesting topic that's worthy of further discussion for sure. It's possible we just pay for this change through bills, although arguably it's a lot fairer for the government funding to pay for these changes, to allow households to have capital grants so that households don't face any sort of upfront cost burdens. And while there are costs, it's worth pointing out there are really significant benefits to this. You can end up with a healthier and warmer home. It allows us maximising the use of homegrown renewable energy. It will reduce gas and other fossil fuel imports, and also it allows for a really high-tech focus on jobs and skills. Now, I'm just going to end with a quick word of caution here. This is a huge transition, and the gas industry has a lot to lose. And through my own research, it's become clear that there's strong resistance to these changes, and that's something you really need to be aware of. It means that things like heat pumps and new ideas do struggle. And the idea of simply converting the gas grid in the UK to hydrogen is being strongly promoted by some of these interests, but we just don't know how much it will cost, and it looks quite expensive. It's never even been done anywhere before, so we don't even know whether it's possible. And actually, very few countries are thinking about it. It's also possible that the fossil fuel industry is pushing this as a route to maintain their existing gas interests. So when it comes to hydrogen, I think it makes sense to do some trials, and then we'll know more about it. But fundamentally, for me, certainly for now, the huge focus of the heating transition in the UK needs to be focusing on not just energy efficiency, but also on electrification. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Richard. And Richard will be here for the Q&A after the break. So if we take our 30 seconds now to think about any key questions and thoughts. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to our final presentation. This is from Gervais Mangwana. Gervais lives in Herefordshire and has retrofitted his own home. So he's going to give his presentation on his experience of doing that. But as I mentioned earlier, he's also works for the Carbon Co-op. So he will be here to answer questions any questions that come up from Jonathan Atkin's presentation too. Thanks, Max.
Hello, my name's Gervais Mangwana. I moved to Herefordshire with my small family, young family, in 2018 from Manchester. And we've actually done 2 retrofits because we retrofitted our place in Manchester in 2014. That was the house that we moved from. And I should also say that I work in retrofit. It's my livelihood. I work for a company in Manchester, People Powered Retrofit, Jonathan Atkinson, who I think you'll also be hearing from. And now I'm working in Herefordshire, helping people out get started on their retrofit journeys. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it's like being a homeowner of a retrofitted property, and that sort of involves why we did it, what the obstacles and challenges were for that to it, and what the benefits have been, and then maybe a little bit about the learnings. And while we're doing that, I'm going to share my screen with you, and so you can see some photos that are sort of relevant to it. Okay, so you should see those now. So why did we do it? Well, I had a career in music and traveling the world until 2007, and that I became aware that I was starting to have a very big carbon footprint. I wasn't so much aware of climate change, wasn't so much of a thing there, but it was becoming a thing, and I wanted to get out of that for a number of reasons. I retrained in renewable energy in the built environment, and then very quickly sort of realised that our existing housing stock was a big source of the energy that we use, and particularly the energy that we use to heat our homes formed a large part of the energy budget of the country. And so this was the area that I focused in, and I'd moved in with my wife, who'd lived in a property we lived in Manchester. She'd lived in it for many years. I lived in it for a couple of years, and we decided that when we modernised it, it was time to retrofit it deeply as well. And so that was one of the big reasons that we did it. I wanted to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. But also it wasn't the greatest house to heat. It was pretty uncomfortable. The fuel bills weren't so expensive then, so that wasn't a major factor for us at the time, although it would be now. So carbon was probably our main driver, along with modernisation. And then when we moved to Hereford, we'd already done the one in Manchester, and one of the big things that came out of it somewhat unexpectedly was that an allergy to dust that I'd suffered from almost all my life totally cleared up from the air quality improvement from the ventilation system that we used. So that became a big driver for when we moved to Hereford. We wanted to do another retrofit, so we found a house that needed modernisation, and then we so our drivers again were carbon and comfort, I'd say, and because I knew that we were off gas grid here, that would be more expensive to heat, and so fuel bills was a consideration here as well. We knew we were intending to stay here for 20 years or so, and so as fuel bills rose, and I expected them to do so as they are doing now, that was going to become a bigger consideration as we got into later life. So those are the main reasons of why. Some of the obstacles I think I found are the amount of time and planning that has to go into it, the problems that you can run into during the job because it's an existing house and you maybe don't uncover them until you've got part way through. The budget, the cost, it's very, very expensive. Managing that budget is quite difficult because things crop out through the project, which means that planning is very necessary. There's a technical side to it, so there's a lot to learn. I think maybe when we have sort of more standard building jobs done in our homes, we don't need to get so involved in them, but with retrofit it is quite technical, and as yet the contractors and designers, particularly the builders, they're not familiar so much with the kind of practices. And so you kind of need, as a homeowner, we sort of need a bit more technical knowledge to do that. Hopefully that's going to change over time as it becomes more widespread. And then a personal one for me is I just found that with all the decisions that needed to be made for the thermal stuff, there was also the decisions to be made with regard to putting my home back together again. You see from the pictures that we kind of take it apart and put it back together again. So there's a lot of decisions to be made with repainting everything, a new kitchen, new bathroom, new joinery, so many decisions. I found that quite a strain in the end. You'll see also one of the pictures where a wall fell down. So, you know, things do crop up during projects as well. So what are the benefits? As I've already mentioned, that air quality was a huge benefit for us, and somewhat unexpected. Comfort is a huge one. We now heat our home to about 20 degrees, 24 hours a day, because that's more efficient in a low energy home. It's much cheaper than it would have been in this house. We saved about 80% on our bills in Manchester on the house we did there, and I suspect it would probably be closer to 90% on this house here. And those bills are now rising. So I expect that the savings are well into 4 figures annually. And for me, some of the benefit has been about learning so that I can apply this more widely to the kind of unique, shall we say, housing stock that we have in Herefordshire, which I'm starting to learn a little bit more about. So yeah, I think the main benefits for us have been, well, we got a modernised house out of it as well. You know, we got a new finish out there, and a chance to rethink a property as well. You do get that chance to rethink the way that your house is laid out, perhaps. So that's another benefit, I'd say. So, but mainly, you know, the benefits are the cost of fuel bills, the comfort, the air quality, and then of course the huge reduction in carbon that we're able to make through retrofitting our homes. I think I've already touched a little bit on the learnings that I can sort of see from this, taking it forward. For me, the learnings from this place are how I can apply them to the housing stock in general, and the people that I've met, the contractors that I've met, the contractors who got skilled up in new areas that I met that can be applied to further retrofits in the county. That's it from me. I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A session. Thanks a lot. Bye.
So thank you to Gervais. So we'll take our 30 seconds, note down any key questions or thoughts. Thank you. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening to the 3 presentations, and thank you very much to our speakers too. We're going to move you again now into your breakout groups, and your facilitators will work through questions that you'd like to ask as a group to the panel. Thank you.
Grab a little bit of fresh air or caffeine or whatever's going to keep you awake for the rest of the afternoon. So we're going to move straight into our Q&A session with our panel of speakers. So we've got Richard Lowes here, Gervais and Ben from Herefordshire Council. And I'm going to first come to Kathy. Kathy, you can ask the first question from your group, please.
Yes, we've got a wide range of questions, actually. One of the things that came up through a couple of our group members was asking about whether Herefordshire has some sort of a kite mark or an underwritten standard of building standards for contractors or companies who do retrofitting and understanding of renewable energies. And if not, is that something that could be established and set up where potentially, if they don't have these in neighbouring counties, where those businesses could also benefit by being on a sort of a contractor, an approved contractors list, if you like, that meeting that sort of standard, that would build confidence amongst consumers and buyers of those products?
I'm not aware of that existing anywhere, actually. The system that we have for retrofit that I'm aware of is PAS 2035, which is still kind of in its infancy, and then so that is overseen by the trust mark system. So all the different parts that that fall under PAS 2035 from the retrofit coordinator, retrofit designer, retrofit assessor, and indeed installers, all have to be approved under the Trustmark system. But it's really geared up for quite large scale stuff, and it's very bureaucratic to become Trustmark approved, and therefore like small independent traders find it very hard to be involved with that. And as Jonathan pointed out in his presentation, it's those kind of small local business people that are more likely to be doing this kind of work. So it's an interesting idea, and something that we had looked at with a couple of groups in Hereford in the last 12 months about getting a sort of a way of having an approved list. First of all, training some contractors and then getting them onto an approved list so that they'd done something that could assure that their work was going to be to some extent kind of recognised as being adequate.
Okay, thanks, Yves. So I'm just going to go to Ben. He's got his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Just to completely agree with what Yves just said there. And just to add, I suppose, in Herefordshire on the domestic side, we do have an energy efficiency advice line, which is run by 7Y Energy Agency, where we offer free and impartial advice and assistance through grants and finding installers locally. So if people are interested in that, that's a really good way. But as he said, you know, there isn't a Herefordshire kite mark. There is evolving national standards. So.
Okay, and maybe we can share that information on the advice line, Ben. Yeah. That would be great if we can do that either through the chat or on Basecamp. Richard, can I come to you then?
Yeah, hi everyone. A quick one from me, just to come back on that. So for renewable energy installations, and this includes heat pumps, there's an organisation called the Microgeneration Certification Scheme, MCS, and they're the national sort of standards people for heat pumps. And so you can go onto their website and you can actually find local installers. So it's not local to Herefordshire, but it is at a UK level. And one thing just to add, there was a question previously raised about whether a heat pump will be big enough to warm up your house on the coldest day. If you go through that MCS system, there are guarantees there that the system is designed to make sure that on the coldest day your house gets hot, because heat pumps work down to perhaps beyond -20 degrees for an outside temperature, but they need to be sized correctly. And that's what the MCS standard tries to do.
Okay, somebody just quickly asked what MCS stands for. Richard.
Oh, sorry. I did say, I think, a Microgeneration Certification Scheme.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks for that. So Lauren, can we come to your group and can you let us know who the questions aimed at?
Yes, oh, so many questions, but I think the one that we'll go for at the top is there a middle ground between doing nothing and a full retrofit to the level that Gervais talked about? And I think that's kind of not just private homeowners, but, you know, housing association and the rental sector as well. And I think that's probably, Richard, you might be able to answer that one.
Sure, I'll try my best. I think it's a really good question. I think it depends on the building. So if you've got a solid walled building, you know, getting to insulating those solid walls is quite a big job. It depends on the type of house. If it's a very old house, you might want to do it internally, which is even more difficult. But if you're doing that, that is quite a big job. If you've got a house, for example, with cavity walls that aren't done, or loft insulation that needs topping up, that's less of a big job. And then you can go even further than that, doing things like proper air tightness, which is even more complicated, but over the long term will reduce your bills. So there often is a middle ground, but it very much depends on the type of building. It's very building specific, and that's where you need to get an expert in to come and really do the assessment for you.
Okay, good question. Thank you very much. Okay, next group, we're going to come to Vicky's group.
Oh, Gervais, of course,
you want to just, yeah, of course.
That's definitely my area. Yeah, there absolutely is a middle ground. And yeah, what I've presented is probably the biggest extreme of retrofit. There is a point at which doing very little there isn't any point in doing it. It's a waste of both the money and the carbon that is put into doing the work. So finding that sweet spot for homeowners and indeed for social housing. I'm doing some social housing at the moment outside the county actually. It often is very much a middle ground that we're aiming for, and the space heating targets tend to be a little bit higher. but a lot of homeowners either don't have the budget or the house isn't suitable. So yeah, we do try and find those middle grounds for where everybody can fit. But there is something that almost everybody can do.
That's great. Thanks, Gervais. Vicky, can we come to you? Can you come up with your top question, please, on behalf of your group?
Yes, our top question sort of related to that last one a little, which is to Gervais really, and possibly anyway, any of you, three of you really, but is the affordability of it, which you've touched on, Gervais. I mean, I think, you know, people looked at what you did and blenched at the thought of doing it, and I know there's a middle ground. You've talked about that. So the other question I would say, secondly, to go on to our second question, was the local planning system, how helpful are local planning systems when you're trying to do this, particularly in Herefordshire, where we have 6,000 listed buildings and people have come up against problems in that regard. So that would be maybe start with you, Gervais, and then move on to one of the other two.
Yeah, so I'll start with the money side of things. It is expensive, and yeah, I appreciate that people will blench at what we did here. The job I did in Manchester, which I also mentioned, was a lot cheaper, but still, I don't know if you remember on Jonathan's presentation, he sort of there was a breakdown of kind of the amount of money that people might have available to this, a bit of a bell curve, and there was that chunk in the middle where there was 20 to 50 and 50 to 100, and in those brackets, in that bracket, there's still really useful things to be done, but the money really has to be used very carefully. And that's why assessment is so important, so that processes aren't started without the full job being fully understood. But yeah, there's definitely stuff that can be done. It has got more expensive, and we can only hope that there's going to be assistance, because none of us are going to get anywhere near to what we need to get to unless there's money made available, in my opinion.
And yep.
Sorry, what was the second question?
Well, the second question was, were the planning system helpful to you?
They were amazing here, actually. I'm currently doing an assessment for a place out sort of near Tarrington, which is listed, so most houses. It was an Oast house that was renovated, but is still listed, and they're in conversation with the conservation officers. They are more challenging, definitely. They are more challenging. There's limits to what you're able to do, but there's limitations in so many different ways in every single job, that it's just another limitation to work within. So, you know, whether it be budget, or whether it be, you know, it's part of a terrace, so you've got neighbours. That's a limitation on what can be done. Yeah, for listed properties, it's difficult, and there are some properties that. Yeah, I've had one this week that's right in the north of the county, and through the process that I've been with them, they've decided there actually doesn't make any sense for them to do anything because of how long they're going to be there and what is required to make a significant difference to the house. It's not a house that can be tweaked. So okay. There are maybe things that have to get left behind.
Okay, Ben, did you want to jump in there quickly? We've got two more groups to get through.
Yeah, just very quickly, just on the finance side of things, the link I put in earlier, which is the Keep Herefordshire Warm website, that's our one-stop shop for all of the financial support that's available as well, so it'd be really useful to navigate people towards that. And I think just, I suppose, on the wider planning, probably covered more in the next session on new builds, but we are developing a new planning guidance, which is very much underway at the moment, looking at new builds and new standards as well. Just so I've had a couple of questions directly, so I thought I'd mention that.
Okay, thanks, Ben, that's great. And Mary, can we come to your group, please?
This is for Gervais, please. How sustainable were the base materials and products that you used, the cement and wood, or did you look at that, and was that an important element of the build as well?
My personal take on this, and everybody has a different position on it, is that I have what I call a pragmatic view of it. So the loft insulation, for example, was recycled newspaper, cellulose recycled newspaper. The walls were insulated with an oil-based derivative, polystyrene. So I tried to go for a mix. I looked at the possibility of using wood fibre for the walls, which is what I'd used previously in Manchester. and it just wasn't really practical in the situation here. So I tend to look at it as a bit of a mix. I'd prefer, if possible, to go with the more sensitive materials, and there's definitely a big argument or big discussion to have about what people call the carbon burp, which is if we do all this work, but we do it all with highly carbon intensive materials, then actually we're going to be using up a huge piece of carbon budget just in the process of doing it, and there maybe isn't time for that. So that's something that does get thrown into the mix as well.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks, Gervase. Okay, and Paul's group, finally, can we come to you?
Thank you. Yeah, just one quick one for Gervase, probably. Talked a lot in Herefordshire about having a lot of old housing stock. So what can we do about all of that? And if we can include in that, you know, the actual incentivization cost, kind of what's in it for the people who live in those buildings? Will they need some grants, or are they going to have to pay for it themselves? And then the very quick question for Richard is a technical one. You focus a lot on heat pumps, but what about other technology like infrared panel heating and extra low voltage underfloor heating?
So yeah, there is a lot of old properties. I still maintain, like almost all the properties that I'm doing in Hereford, and I think I've got about 9 on the go at the moment, all have some age element to them, many of them over 100 years old, some of them over 200 years old, or at least in part. There's definitely stuff that can be done. It is very expensive. Obviously, it depends on what people's money have got. At the moment, there isn't a lot, as far as I'm aware, and Ben may be able to talk to this more. There isn't significant assistance that can be had from a regular homeowner. There may be there may be access to stuff more through social for people in more social housing situations that I'm not aware of. We can only hope that money comes along to help with people, because there isn't likely to be enough cash sort of slurping around for people to do significant jobs on their homes, unless they've got money that they've put aside for it. There are long-term benefits in the bills, but there's still no way that the work that needs doing will stack up even over 20 years in the bill savings. We can't look at it as a payback from bill savings. That definitely isn't going to happen.
It seemed like a quite critical thing. Sorry, just to follow up on that.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
I guess maybe the question that people are asking is, what can we ask for in this assembly that might make some of that money more available?
Right. Well, I'm not fully aware of the council structure, but I would be lobbying the council and getting the council to lobby as hard as possible to central government to make money available for genuine energy efficiency measure schemes, not what they have done to this date, which is economy stimulus packages, which get reshuffled as energy efficiency, and therefore, you know, like the Green Home Grant Scheme, are ultimately unsuccessful. Really, we want genuine money for people to genuinely able to put into their home.
Okay, thanks. Ben, do you want to pick up on anything before we move to Richard?
Yeah, if you've got time, I can quickly jump in. I mean,
we've got 5 minutes and we just need to cover Richard.
Okay, well, just to say, I mean, there's 2 things there. We're currently developing a new retrofit strategy for Herefordshire, really trying to say, okay, there's all this national support there, but it's not enough to meet the challenge. How do we take that forward? So we're doing a lot of work on that, which will help inform that. But yeah, it's a huge challenge. And again, on funding, you mentioned the Green Homes Grant. We've got a Green Homes Grant project, which is looking at retrofits. We've got a Warm Homes Fund project, which is looking at off-gas grid and looking at some projects looking really at air source heat pumps and fully funding those. But it's not enough to do the whole county. I mean, you're talking hundreds of homes rather than this. I think I said we've got about 70,000 in the county. So, you know, it's a huge area. We've been good at pulling money in, but there's so much to do there. So it's a huge opportunity, but a challenge at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Ben. And there was a secondary question, wasn't there, from you, Paul? Richard, can you still remember it?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Claire. So the question was, I focused on heat pumps quite a lot. What about other electricity technologies like infrared panels and underfloor electric heating? And the reason I focus on heat pumps is because they basically look a lot cheaper over time for people. So they can produce much lower bills than other types of electric heating. I'll just explain that very quickly. So if you have something like an infrared heater, it's effectively converting your electricity to heat an efficiency of about 100%. So you put 1 unit of electricity in and you get 1 unit of heat out. With a heat pump, basically you get an efficiency of 300, maybe 400, or possibly even 500% with the ground source heat pump. So you put 1 unit of electricity in and you get 3, 4, or 5 units of heat out, sorry. And what that means is that the heat pump, compared to electric heating, standard electric heating, like underfloor electric, which I've had before, is effectively way over a third cheaper. So it's a lot cheaper. Sorry, it's a third of the cost, I should say, rather than a third cheaper. So it's significantly cheaper running costs. And just if I might finish with an anecdote, I lived in a G-rated EPC flat when I was a student, and we had electric underfloor heating. And we ended up moving out because the heating costs were so expensive. And that's when electricity was costing about 10 or 11 pence a unit. And now it's up to about 25 pence a unit. So if that had a heat pump in it, the bills would have been about a third, and perhaps I'd still be living there.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Okay, so I just want to reassure people. I know there were lots of questions that came up in response to the building, that first part of buildings. Just to reassure you, none of your questions will go unanswered. We will share those unanswered questions with our speakers. We'll make sure that they are answered and put into Basecamp. And also we're monitoring the chat. So anything that is raised via chat that needs a response, we'll be doing that as well. So I just don't want people sitting here thinking, oh, you know, I really need the answer to my question. You will get it. So thank you so much to all our speakers for that first panel. And I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, and she's going to introduce the second part of the buildings theme, which is focused around new buildings.
That's great, thank you, Claire. So yes, as Claire said, we're going to move on to our second group of presentations now, which is focused more on new buildings and planning and regulations. So the first speaker that we're going to be hearing from, we have 3 again, is Hugh Ellis, who is the Policy Director for the Town and Country Planning Association. And Hugh's going to tell us about why local ambitions are so far ahead of the national policy.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Hugh Ellis. I'm Director of Policy at the TCPA. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to you in your process of giving Herefordshire a sustainable future and dealing with the climate crisis. Just so that you know, Town and Country Planning Association is a small charity. We've been working on climate change for about 30 years. We're interested in housing, affordable housing and planning. And it's interesting, isn't it, to reflect that 30 years is a long time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate crisis and where we are. I'm going to talk a little bit about the planning system and how important that is for your conversations around buildings and climate change. And then I'm going to say a little bit about some of the problems which central government has given you to deal with and what I think some of the ways around that might be. I'm not going to use any PowerPoint slides. I'm going to do it at a high level. So if you're interested in more detail, there's 2 really important resources that we've produced. One is a guide for local authorities on tackling climate change. We produced that with the Royal Town Planning Institute, and you can find that on the TCPA website. And that, I hope, will give us a really good range of information and particular solutions that you could pursue in your process. The second resource is one that we've produced with the Flood Forum, which is community organisations responding to the impacts of climate change and severe flooding. And that actually contains some briefings that sets out how the planning system works. I have to say, some of it is likely to induce a migraine because the planning system is pretty complicated, but that's also on our website. So those are the background resources. And if you want more detail, you can go there. I'm not going to talk about the climate science. I know you've already had some excellent presentations on that, but I am talking to you from Derbyshire. We have something in common with your county, I guess, and I'm talking to you from a market town. And all I would say about climate impacts is that 2 people have died in our town over the last 24 months in flood events. As I said to you at the beginning, it's been 30 years of working on climate change for me. All I would say about it is that we have to get this right. The impacts from climate change are going to hit us hard. So we have to adapt to those challenges, and we have to do that so urgently. And then we have to get control of emissions if we're going to have any kind of a sustainable future. The debate about whether it's happening or not is over. The debate about climate denial is over. Now we're into an argument about survival and what we do about it. And that's really, I guess, what your process is about. So the climate crisis is here, but the interesting thing about it, and the more positive thing about it, is that we have all the solutions that we need in our hands. You're having other presentations from other experts on what some of those solutions look like in relation to buildings. And Herefordshire, I know as a council, is also producing a range of really useful responses to the climate crisis. But we are not short of solutions in terms of how we deal with how buildings perform, or how we can make them flood resilient, or how we can deal with temperatures, or how we can deal with resource use. All of those technical solutions exist. They're all being deployed somewhere in the world, and particularly in other European councils and municipalities. The question that we're confronting here is whether we have the political will to create the frameworks to make them happen. And that's really important, because sometimes we can fall down a rabbit hole sometimes with technical questions, but actually it's the political question that's the most important one. And the answer to that question is, if you want to survive, if we want to thrive, if people want to be able to insure their property going forward, if we want to be able to look our grandchildren in the face, it's the political drive to make climate change a top priority. Nothing else is possible till we get through the climate crisis. And so that's why we need to put it front and center of what we do. In terms quickly of planning, I'm an incredible enthusiast for planning, but it's not got the best of reputations. I'm going to say just two quick things about it. The potential for planning to shape buildings and places and the design of neighbourhoods and the design of communities to put climate change at the heart of it is huge. Planning is critical to that in relation to building standards and energy, for example, transport, the location of development. It's an exciting and really powerful these solutions together. And importantly, it also has the community's voice at its heart, or it should have it at its heart. So your voice in shaping the policies necessary to go forward are there. So the potential of planning is there, but the current practice of planning is what I'll talk about next. And that's kind of what I've been asked to say a few words in terms of the challenge for local communities. And just very quickly on that, essentially we live in a country in England which is really highly centralised, and a lot of power has been taken away from local communities and local government on planning, and it's been centralised in Westminster. That would be okay if Westminster knew what it was doing. But after 30 years of working there, I'm beginning to suspect that Westminster does not know what it's doing. And that means a lot of emphasis, I think, needs to be focused on local action. As an example, a couple of the key barriers, I think, in planning, one has been about deregulation. So a lot of conversion of factory units and commercial premises can now happen without planning permission and without it through permitted development, and without, therefore, the opportunity to embed climate change at the heart of decision making. That's just one example, and you can find a lot more of those resources and descriptions of what's happened on the TCPA website. And then secondly, things like viability testing, where because our model of housing delivery is focused very much on what the volume house builders will produce, and because they can argue that climate measures have an impact on their financial viability. Okay, so that is a way that they can argue out of doing the right thing. Now that is changing, and policy on viability has changed. Without going into the technical detail, the most important learning that comes out of that is be precise in what you're asking for as communities in your plans. And precision means that developers will find it harder not to comply. And it also means that the costs that are generated, if there are costs of meeting new requirements in buildings, get passed on to landowners. Essentially, people pay less for land in order to comply with those regulations. So it's very important to be precise and to be ambitious and kind of not to take no for an answer in negotiating. That's very important. Communities need to be behind their planners, love your planners, and support them in the grand argument about how we can build better places. The final thing I'd say then, just to finish off, is that there are some barriers in front of you. There's an enormous challenge, but it's interesting to me that don't wait for central government. Don't wait for some magic wand to be waved for the future of Herefordshire. You know, as communities, what the demands and challenges are. Crack on with it, okay? We have wasted almost over 10 years in a kind of flip-flop from central government on climate change, not least the disastrous cancellation of the Zero Carbon Homes Commitment in 2016. And almost all the great innovation that's come out of action on climate change, like the Merton rule, which is a rule in planning about the percentage of renewable energy required on a particular site, all that came from the local level. So failure is not an option, is it, on climate? The debate you're having is the most important debate we've had in the post-war era. Be positive, don't take no for an answer, recognise the confidence you have in the technical solutions, and above all, get on with it really quick. I hope that's been a useful description of some of the challenges that come out of planning buildings, and I really wish you well with your process in Herefordshire. Thanks.
So thank you very much to Hugh, who will be joining us for Q&A. So we'll take our 30 seconds now to note down key points and questions, please. Okay, so moving on to the second presentation. This is from John Christophers, who's an independent consultant chartered architect and client design advisor. And John's going to talk to us a little bit about the Herefordshire Future Homes Standard and some of those other regulations which Hugh referred to as well in his presentation. Thanks, Max.
Everyone, my name is John Christophers. I'm a practicing architect, and I'm here to talk about the Herefordshire Future Homes Standard. In other words, the environmental standards that we can look for new homes to be built to. I want to talk a bit about the carbon that comes from homes, that there are huge savings possible if we build to better standards. There are wider sustainability standards as well to talk about, and the extra cost is not huge. And in fact, it would be much cheaper to do it now than to do it later. So firstly, the building regulations to which all buildings in the country are designed are not what we're getting on site. New homes which have been recently completed can be performing up to 60% worse than designed. And these graphic photos show that this is often because there are gaps in the insulation, that the homes are not built to a good quality standard. So the regulations are letting us down, but the regulations are one part of the picture. There are lots of different standards, a whole confusion of different standards to which homes can be designed. And the standard at the bottom, the Passive House standard, will be explained in more detail later. But suffice it to say that if we were to build to the Passive House standard rather than to the building regulation standard, firstly, it's independently certified, and so we can be more assured that we will be getting what we have designed. But secondly, the Passive House Plus standard, as the graphic on the right of this graph shows, gives more or less zero carbon in operation. In other words, all the energy that the building needs can be generated by solar panels on the roof if we build to the Passive House Plus standard. And that's because we will have reduced the energy usage right down compared with other standards. Because it's a certified standard, we will be sure that that is the standard that the thing is going to be built to. And the savings then, which we can achieve on that, are very dramatic. This graph shows that the top line, the solid red line, shows the energy which would be used in running a home built to current building regulation standards with a gas-fired boiler. The dotted heavy green line at the bottom of the graph shows the carbon emissions which would come from a house built to the Passive House Plus standard, which I've just described, the Herefordshire Future Homes Standard, with super insulation and powered not by a gas-fired boiler, but by a very efficient electric heat pump. And the savings are dramatic, 92% saving in carbon, or 64 tonnes of carbon over the 60 years in which that home would be in operation. So I think the figures speak for themselves. Now, if we think about this Passive House standard, it's a standard which is already being used, in fact, for council housing in a number of progressive authorities, Exeter, Norwich, York and elsewhere. It needs much less heating. There's very good air tightness so that there are no leaky drafts where we might be losing our heat. And we have a heat recovery system so that in the winter, you don't need to open the windows and lose a lot of heat, but mechanical ventilation with heat recovery will give you constant fresh air. If the house faces the right way, then we can make sure that the windows facing the sun will actually give useful heat gains in the winter. As I say, if we don't need gas boilers, then we've cut out a great chunk of carbon, and we've got these high efficiency electric heat pumps for the heating and hot water. So the whole operation of the house can be more or less zero carbon if we build to this Passive House Plus standard. But that leaves another part of the carbon footprint of a home. We need to split that into two parts. There's the operational carbon, the carbon used for running the home, for the heating, the lighting, hot water, computers, fridges, etc. But there is also the carbon which is used in building the house. And so what I would advocate is that we should look at this embodied carbon, the carbon being used to build the house as well, because that can be as much as half the carbon footprint of the house over its lifetime. So it seems crazy to leave half of the carbon out of the picture. So the Herefordshire Future Home Standard suggests very low standards for the embodied carbon, a low level of embodied carbon, meaning that we should be using more low energy materials such as timber and less high energy materials such as concrete and steel. And amazingly, this embodied carbon, the embodied carbon locked up in the building itself, is not controlled by any legislation at the moment, any government legislation. But as Hugh has been describing earlier, the local authorities are able to set their own standards independently to set a standard which is, in this case, would be higher than the government standard of the embodied carbon as well as the operational carbon. I also want to throw in the One Planet Living criteria. These are 10 different criteria which look at a much wider a wider picture of sustainability than simply the carbon. We're living as if we've got the resources of 3 planets, but in fact we only have 1 planet. And as well as the carbon used in the building and heating the building and so forth, if we can look at things like water, food, travel and transport, the materials used, etc., then these will fill in a lot of the gaps and make the Herefordshire Future Home Standard much wider than just carbon, but to look at lifestyle and all these other different issues. So the full Herefordshire Future Home Standard is at these links, and you can look at the different graphs, the references, the background, and so forth. But finally, I've described that we've got a lot of carbon. 27% of Herefordshire's carbon is from homes, of which the majority is heating. The national standards, in my personal view, are not ambitious enough, but standards such as the Passive House Plus standard can give these very dramatic carbon savings of over 90%. That we need to look at both the running costs, the operational carbon, and the building costs, the embodied carbon. And we need to look at wider standards as covered by the One Planet Living 10 criteria. But you may be asking, well, can we afford to do this? And the good news is that the extra cost of building to the standards I'm describing is only around 5%, maybe as little as 4%, according to some reports, if we exclude the solar panels, but a cost of around 5% on the capital building cost. To give these carbon savings of over 90%. I believe as well that we must look at very well designed buildings. We don't want, if we have poorly designed new homes, then they will be perhaps rightly demolished, and that is not sustainable. We need to have very good quality design as part of this. And to finish with, the government's own climate change committee have said that it will be 5 times cheaper to build to this standard now, rather than to have to upgrade later. If we build to a lesser standard, then it's very likely that in the coming years, those homes will have to be upgraded, have windows ripped out and so forth, which would be a terrible shame. Much better to put in a very slightly more expensive triple glazed, good quality window now, be 5 times cheaper to do that. So I hope the Herefordshire Future Home Standard shows a very good way forward for the new homes for the county. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for the presentation. So we'll take our 30 seconds for you to note down key questions and thoughts. Thank you. So it's time now to move on to our final presentation for the day, and it's from Emily Partridge from Archetype, who are based here in Herefordshire. And Emily is going to talk to us about public buildings, not just homes, and go into a bit more detail about that. Okay, so if you could start that one, please, Max. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emily Partridge. I work at Archetype, an architectural practice specialising in low energy design based just south of Hereford. I'm just going to share my screen. So this is our office. I'm going to talk to you about the challenge we're facing in the construction industry and propose some solutions that will help Herefordshire meet its ambitious climate targets. So first of all, the challenge. We all spend most of our time in buildings, and to make buildings comfortable, we all know we need to heat them, we need to light them, we need to ventilate them, and that takes energy, and this in turn emits carbon. So as you'll have already heard, buildings are responsible for around 40% of the total carbon emitted nationally. The challenge is how we can reduce that. So what's the answer? Well, a really easy answer would be to rely on the electricity grid being decarbonised and to swap from heating our buildings as we do at the moment with fossil fuels such as oil and gas to electricity. However, changing to electric heating would cause a huge increase in the demand for electricity, and it's also very expensive. Herefordshire would never be able to balance the energy demand and the renewable energy supply required unless it significantly reduces consumption of energy in our buildings. Building regulations, that is the rules that have to be followed when you build or refurbish a building, do not come anywhere near the level required to achieve current climate targets. There are two problems with them. Firstly, the energy standards within them are simply too lax. And secondly, although on paper buildings might meet those standards, in reality and in use, buildings perform much worse than those standards, sometimes up to 3 to 5 times worse. And that gap between the energy use of a building as it is designed and the energy use in reality is called the performance gap. And we think this is totally unacceptable. If you bought a car which was sold as doing 50 miles per gallon and it only did 20, there'd be total outrage. Now, so the simplest thing that could be done would be to tighten up standards and enforce them more robustly, but not just a little bit. We need a really significant shift. And is that possible? Well, the good news is that we already know how to do this, and it doesn't require any complicated new technologies. It doesn't need us to wait for the invention of some new wonder insulation material or flashy gizmo. We know how to do it. Archetype uses an international standard called Passive House to achieve low energy buildings. Passive House is backed by a robust analytic design enforced by rigorous evidence-based certification. If this was to be demanded, this would create a paradigm shift in our journey towards zero carbon future. Would it really work? Well, Passive House has been around for more than 30 years across Europe. And for the last 15 years, Archetype has been designing buildings in the UK to the Passive House standard. Monitoring has proved that these buildings now save around 90% of the energy required for heating and around 70% of the overall total energy for heating, lighting, and all other uses. Passive House requires us to follow some very simple rules of good design. Firstly, improving the building fabric with increased insulation, triple glazed windows, airtight construction. Secondly, looking at the form and orientation of the building to maximise useful warmth from the sun while shading out what sun would cause overheating. And then having improved the building itself, you can then keep the heating and ventilation systems within that really simple and efficient. And then the third-party certification ensures that the construction is to the same high standard as that design. And that results in comfortable healthy buildings which use dramatically less energy and which are backed up by a quality assurance standard. Someone once said to me, this sounds like common sense. Why isn't it more common? We could make it common across England by making it mandatory in building regulations for all new and for all refurbished buildings. Unless it's made mandatory, the required improvements just simply won't happen, or they simply won't happen fast enough. We don't have time to leave it to chance or to rely on the willingness of clients, architects, contractors to do it. A good example of how to ensure improvements can be seen in the action of the Scottish Futures Trust. They set an energy target for all new schools in Scotland. Local councils then had to achieve that energy target every year for 25 years in order to receive capital funding from Scottish Government. This is creating a transformation across Scotland. Every local council, every architect, every engineer, every contractor is now looking for the best way to deliver to the energy standard. I really hope we can do similar here. The good news is that low energy building, such as passive house, are very, very rapidly becoming more common. Herefordshire, in fact, already has some fantastic examples of passive house buildings. Here are some. On the left, we've got Beacon View, which is one of Archetype's projects. It's a group of passive house homes, and you can see it's got photovoltaic PV panels on the roof. It also has an air source heat pump. The houses are timber framed and they use recycled newspaper insulation. In Herefordshire, there are passive house homes, renovations, extensions, village halls, also archives. So this is the Herefordshire Archive and Record Centre in Rotherwas in Hereford, which some of you might recognise. This was the UK's first archive storage to be built to the passive house standard. It's well insulated. There's shading to prevent overheating in the midday sun. Simple design provides a comfortable, consistent working environment with a constant supply of fresh air all year round, while also meeting the really stringent requirements of constant cool conditions required for storing delicate documents, as well as creating a welcoming, airy, light, bright public foyer and research centres. Hark was one of the first. We've monitored it. It's using 60% less energy than a typical archive building. It costs 80% less to run, and it costs 5% less to build in the first place compared to a standard archive at the time. And what we're achieving is just getting better. As more and more low energy buildings, more passive house buildings are being built, we're learning and we're improving. A recent project I was involved with is a primary school in Wales. They'll be saving £125,000 each year on heating bills, an energy saving of more than 90%. As I said earlier, this is typical now for buildings designed in this way. Further afield, outside Herefordshire, there are hundreds of passive house buildings, new buildings and refurbishments, schools, community centres, swimming pools, flats, doctor surgeries, factories, offices, fire stations, you name it, it's been done. And as you can see, passive house doesn't only radically reduce energy and carbon, but it also creates beautiful, light, airy buildings which are comfortable and healthy with really good air quality. So we know we can do this. We can dramatically cut energy use of running buildings. That's typically the biggest cause of emissions from buildings in the UK. But we need to go even further, looking at the energy used to construct the building in the first place. We're doing this by using natural materials, using timber, minimising the use of steel and concrete, using local materials as much as possible. This can sound a little bit more wishy-washy, but it's really important. And again, it works. So these materials can last as long as conventional building materials and create healthier environments. So what have we learned? We must reduce energy usage, and fast. Passive house is one way to do this, and it's a way that's been proven to work. It doesn't need to cost any more. Once we've then tackled energy from buildings in use, we must monitor them and learn lessons so that we can continually improve and eliminate the performance gap. Then we need to go even further, using local low energy materials to really have a chance of meeting the current climate emergency. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your talks.
Thank you, Emily. I'm feeling like this is becoming my new strapline, but we'll now take 30 seconds to reflect on what Emily has said and note down key questions and any thoughts. Okay, everyone. So we're now going to move you back into your smaller groups with your facilitators. And then when you come back, we're going straight into the Q&A session with the three speakers that you've just heard. So that's Hugh Ellis, John Christophers and Emily Partridge. Welcome back, everybody. We're joined now by John Christophers and Emily Partridge, who you heard from before you went into your group. It doesn't seem like Hugh Ellis has joined us, but he may well pop up on the screen throughout the Q&A. But if I can just go to Lauren first, please, for your question, Lauren. Thank you.
Yes, you can. Sorry, I was just trying to pull them all together. Again, a lot of questions there, but we had one specifically about solar thermal, please. We've not heard that really talked about at all by any of the experts. Can I open that up and just get someone to comment on? We had an experience of actually using that locally, but not being able to get any local information about that, and some lived experience of it actually working really well. So can I ask our experts just to talk about that?
Thank you, Lauren. John, can we come to you first, please?
Thank you. Yes, solar thermal is a great thing to have. Hot water panels that generate hot water on the roof. And the only reason that it's not, it didn't feature in the very brief overview that I gave, is obviously we've got limited resources. And if one is putting money into electric panels on the roof, which will work for the whole year round, and one is putting money into an air source heat pump, then that's quite a capital investment, and those are what I would want to prioritize if one had to make a decision on those things. But I've got absolutely I think the solar thermal panels are great where they're appropriate, and I think one has to say for different buildings there are different solutions. So I don't know if Emily's got anything she wants to add to that.
No, completely agree with you, John. They're brilliant, but I think photovoltaic panels, which are solar panels that create electricity, and air source heat pumps and these other renewables tend to be a better priority in terms of renewables.
Great, thank you, Emily. Okay, so we'll go to Vicky's group next for your question, please, Vicky.
Sorry, I was just trying to remind myself what our top questions are. So our question really is about the passive house. What are the barriers to, this is to Emily obviously, what are the barriers to passive houses becoming standard, and are the designs of passive houses very limited, and therefore they might become a little samey after a time? So two questions in one, I'm afraid.
Okay, yeah, Emily, should we start with you and then go over to John?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with your second question on the designs being limited. No, absolutely not. You can design a passive house you can build it out for anything. You can make it look like anything you want to, as long as you're following the basic kind of good principles of orientating it to get the sun. So if you do a bit of Googling, you'll find all sorts of weird and wonderful, bizarre and brilliant passive houses. So no, it shouldn't be seen as a limit to the design. In terms of the barriers to passive house, I think in the past there has been a perceived that it's more expensive, or that it's very complicated to do. That's not the case. That needn't be the case. And we're finding more and more now that it is becoming rapidly more common as the industry is starting to upskill. So the first times we were doing the first passive houses that we're building in the UK, it was all very new. And triple glazed windows, where do you get them from, all of this stuff? But now that market is there, and the whole industry is very quickly upskilling to deliver that. We've also now got 30 years of lessons learned from building passive houses, so we now know that it doesn't have to be more expensive, it doesn't have to be more complicated. In fact, it simplifies a lot of different things, which is I think why in the last couple of years it's rapidly becoming more important. But John, what would your thoughts be on that one?
Yes, I agree with all that. I think cost has historically been a big barrier, Vicky. And I think when Exeter, who were the first council who said at scale, we're going to do everything, passive house, all our council housing, I think they reckon they were paying 25% more to do it at that time. But that was when, you know, you could hardly buy a triple glazed window in this country. And I think their costs are now have come down to pretty much the same is what they say. I don't think I would ever pretend to people that it would be as cheap. I think there is a small premium, but I think it's very well worth it over the longer term. And certainly, you know, if you want to build a Palladian villa or whatever, I think you can do it with passive house. There's no prescribed design, it's actually a very narrow technical standard. It says it's really looking. It's come out of building science to see why are buildings not performing as they should. And so, you know, if we can get the insulation around the building, the air tightness, we can get all this right, then that is all that passive house is interested in. So the wider sustainability issues that I was talking about, the One Planet Living, to look at transport, to look at the materials, to look at embodied carbon. Passive house is completely silent on those, and that's why I think we need to bolt those on to get a bigger picture. So passive house, I think, is a very, very good standard on a narrow front, but it needs to be. It's not a silver bullet in itself.
Okay, thank you both for that. So if we can move to Mary now for your key question, please, Mary.
Sorry, I'm always late and taking myself off mute.
It's all right.
This was a particular question around passive house standards, and also what's the life expectancy of buildings using these materials, particularly if there were issues around water ingress and dampness. It's quite a specific question there. I don't know if Emily, if you can cover that, or...
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first on that one. So exactly as John's just said, passive house sits slightly separately to what you're building, embodied energy, so what we're building out of. So you could build a passive house out of straw or steel or concrete or timber or whatever you want. So in terms of the life expectancy of these lower energy materials, I think it just comes down to designing things robustly. You can have really big issues with steel buildings if they're not designed robustly and you get water ingress. Exactly the same on timber frame. So it's just about designing things robustly so that they can be built as easily as possible and as simply as possible on site. You know, I always feel for the builders who are on Friday afternoon with horizontal rain and wind, having to build some awkward corner detail of a building. I'm just thinking, oh, forget that, and, you know, head off to the pub or whatever. We've got to design things so that it's simple and so that corners aren't cut, and we're not designing beautiful things on paper that are an absolute nightmare to build. So that would be my first rule, whatever we're building it out of.
Okay, thanks, Emily. We'll go to you now, John. And John, I just wondered if you could also say something about embodied carbon, because that's a phrase that we hear a lot, and just to clarify what's meant by that.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. So I hope it was clear from what I was saying in my talk that if you look at the whole carbon footprint of a house, the same is true of buildings, but I'll talk about houses. But of a house, you've got the operational carbon, which is the carbon emissions which come from the energy used in running the house, the heating, the hot water, computers, lighting, all the day-to-day stuff. And that is one chunk that we're talking about as the operational carbon. And then we've got the embodied carbon, which is the carbon which is used in building the house. So that is typically taken, well, there's a defined standard which takes it as the extraction of the raw materials. If you've got to extract iron ore, there's energy involved in doing that. There's the production of the materials, moving them to site, manufacture, etc. So there's a lot of carbon locked up in making a building, and some building materials are much more energy intensive to use than others. And I think when I was a student of architecture and first looked at this, The embodied carbon, the carbon used in the building was a relatively small proportion because the operational carbon was big. But once we bring this operational carbon right down, and as you've heard, we can bring that down 90% or more, then the embodied carbon becomes much more significant, and it can be as much as half of the total carbon footprint of the building, which we look at over a typical 60-year life, just because we have to pick a period. So that's what the embodied carbon is. I hope that makes sense. And if we're looking at high energy materials such as particularly aluminium, steel, cement and concrete, cement is responsible for no less than 8% and rising of global CO2 emissions. So it's a vast chunk of stuff, and we don't need to use these high energy materials. If we use low energy materials, which typically are wood fiber based, for instance, anything that you can grow is locking up carbon. But there's a whole lot of, sheep's wool, etc. There's a whole range of very low carbon materials. And in the Herefordshire Future Homes Standard, we've set a figure which is aligned with various other standards of 625 kgs of CO2 per cubic metre. So we've set a standard to say we want the embodied carbon of the building to be not more than this standard. So that's the embodied carbon. I think the other thing I'd say about the lifespan is it totally endorse what Emily said about it needs to be well designed. That's the key thing. You can use wood fibre boards, you can use, Herefordshire knows as well as any county, you've got Elizabethan timber frame buildings standing around you which have been there for centuries. Timber is a durable material if it's properly detailed. But I would also say that quality is important. And if we're building to the Passive House Plus standard, which requires very good quality, then you've got a better quality of, for instance, triple glazed windows, which will last longer and will need to be replaced less often. You've got better quality of air tightness, etc., etc. So that means less maintenance, and that means buildings which should be less expensive to run. You've taken out all the gas boilers, you've got less service and maintenance charging, you've taken out all the gas supplies, all the gas meters. So these Passive House Plus buildings should be simpler and less expensive to maintain and run.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, John. Paul, can we move to your group, please, for your question?
Yeah, so there was quite a lot of enthusiasm in our group for the Passive House standard, which some people had heard of, other people were new to. And the kind of reaction was, well, why isn't it there already? So the question kind of is, well, what's needed to get this implemented as a basic standard? And if it's financial, then what needs to happen there to make it such that it's in and all new houses are built to this high standard? So that could be to the experts or the council expert.
Okay, thanks, Paul. We'll start with John first, if that's okay.
Technically, nothing needs to happen. We know, and as Emily says, even in this country, we've got a track record of over a dozen years of building passive house. Because there's more of a critical mass growing, the cost is coming down. I think what we need is the political will, and we need standards to bravely be set. And I think some people have said, look, we're in a bind between cost and quality. We want to build to a certain quality, but we can't afford it. And my answer to that is that if we set the quality that we want, then the costs will follow. I think if the building industry knows, or if it knows locally in Herefordshire, this is the standard to which everything has got to be done, then people can be trained up, and contracts will be competitively tendered. People will be wanting to do this work. The skills will come. But while we're in this bind that the building regulations, as I alluded to briefly in my presentation, there's a whole plethora, confusion of different standards which have come into the vacuum where the government withdrew its code for sustainable homes, which set a standard for zero carbon homes. So I think once we have certainty, then the costs will come down and the skills will come up, and those are the only barriers as I see it. So it just needs clarity rather than anything else.
Is it just a simple matter of the Assembly saying, yes, we want this as a standard in Herefordshire, and then it would happen? Or are we missing something? Is it not quite that simple?
I think it is, in essence, I think it can be that simple. I mean, I think there will be those who, I think the point was made earlier that it's really, I think Hugh made the point that it's the cost of the land which will alter. So I think once there's a roadmap set out to say, okay, every home in Herefordshire needs to be built to this standard, for instance, then the cost of the construction will be fixed. The value of the house that it can be sold for will be estimated, and the value of the land may go down a little bit, which will pay for it. But then the whole thing should become viable financially.
Thank you, John. Ben, did you want to add anything to that in terms of policy barriers and finance from the council's point of view?
Excuse me. So I suppose one piece of work that's underway at the moment, well, two, I suppose. There's a future home standard which John's been working on. That's very much looking at what the council will be building. Our planners are working at the moment on new planning guidance, which is setting new standards. So that's underway at the moment. We're going to be doing a review of all the core strategy and policies going forward. So again, all of that will come together. So the outcomes of this assembly will be really helpful to contribute towards that. I suppose I think again, John said it, there was national policy that said what we could, we were unable to set planning policy locally for a long time, which is why it's all set to national. Now that we can, we're looking to do that. So I'd say that was a barrier locally, but we're working through that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Anything to add, Emily?
Yeah, I think I'd just say that I think defining the standard is really, really important, whether that's council-led or UK-wide. We're finding, whether we're defining that it has to be passive house or defining a specific amount of energy that a building must use maximum. Whatever we're defining, we just have to make sure that is really clear. We're seeing quite a lot at the moment, other councils saying, we're going to insist that all new public buildings in this region are going to be net zero. But net zero is a bit of a waffly term. There's lots of different definitions. How do you prove something is net zero? Does that include embodied and operational? Does it not? So, and that's where things can get vague, and actually the outcome then doesn't happen quite quick enough. So I think defining whatever it is we want to achieve really clearly in black and white is really important.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. I'm just conscious of time, so we're going to go to Kath for the question from your group, please, Kath.
Yeah, our questions are around health, actually, and there's a couple of sort of questions around that. First of all, we wondered if there's any long-term health implications regarding thermal mass, and has any, what is the longest study of any passive house health implications that's been done? And a simple question is, from a living point of view, can you open the windows? Because we're humans and we like fresh air.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Kath. John, should we go to you first?
Certainly you can open the windows, absolutely. And I think we're all Anglo-Saxons. It's perhaps in the blood, or at least I am. But I think more sensibly, I think the key thing is that in the summer, the temperature outside is and spring and autumn to some extent, the temperature outside may not be too bad, and if you open a window, you're letting in air which is not that cold. In the winter, in a passive house, you want to rely really on your mechanical ventilation heat recovery system, so that in the winter it will be natural to keep all the windows shut, to use the ventilation system which extracts warm and humid air from the kitchens and the bathrooms, throws away the air, the stale air, but keeps amazingly 90% of the heat. And so that will be a much better way to do it. You then keep the air moving in the house so that you avoid mold and condensation and any of those sorts of issues. So you probably wouldn't want to open the windows in the winter, but you certainly could in the summer. I think in terms of health, I think the main benefit that I'm aware of is that with this ventilation system I've described, all the incoming air is filtered, and that means that those who have respiratory diseases, asthma, and those sorts of things find that their health is much improved. But I think in addition to that, the problems of people living in cold and damp housing, which create health problems, are completely removed if you're living in a warm house, which is what the Passive House and indeed the Herefordshire Future Homes Standard gives. And if I could just clarify very briefly, there are two standards we're talking about, or have been talking about this afternoon. One is Passive House, and the other is Passive House Plus. And they're basically a very similar standard, but the Passive House standard is simply the standard for insulating the building, etc., air tightness. The Passive House Plus just bolts on some solar panels onto the roof, or other renewables, but typically solar panels, so that the energy, the operational carbon that we've talked about earlier, the energy the house needs to run is generated on site by that house. And that's the standard which has, as someone's asked in the chat, has now been adopted. The Herefordshire Future Home Standard for Herefordshire's own houses, but is not yet applicable to all the homes across the county.
Okay, thanks, John. I was going to ask you to clarify that. I think we've got about 30 seconds, Emily, if there's anything that you want to add to John's response.
Really quickly, then I think, yes, the brilliant thing about Passive House is this mechanical ventilation system. I would say mechanical ventilation system sounds a little bit grim. Everyone loves the sound of natural ventilation. It sounds a lot more pleasant. But if you think of natural ventilation as being ad hoc, uncontrolled drafts, and mechanical ventilation as being a controlled, constant supply of fresh air, then that sounds a bit more what we want. And yes, Archetype have done lots of studies on the health implications of these buildings, and exactly as John said, the outcome is, yeah, really positive.
That's brilliant. So if I can thank our speakers, please. Thank you, John. Thank you, Emily. And also thank you to Hugh, who unfortunately didn't make it to Q&A. But I'm going to hand over to Claire now, who's going to tell you about, you'll be grateful to hear, the last exercise of the day. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. All the best.
Everyone. Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, I'm seeing a few people that look like they're flagging. So I'm kind of just reassuring you, you are on the home straight. Kind of, we recognise it's been a really full-on day. So just quickly, before we move you into your breakout rooms, I'm just going to get you to do a few kind of stretches, okay? I'm just going to kind of ask people, if you're happy to and fancy it, just put your arms in the air, give yourself a little stretch, okay? Maybe do a bit of shoulder rotation. Okay, just loosen yourself up a little bit. Anybody that wants to jump up, do some star jumps, feel obliged to. No pressure. I'm not going to do it, but somebody might be feeling more energetic to me. Well, look, pulls up. That's good. So what about a few kind of neck rotations if we're feeling a little bit tight around there, just to kind of loosen ourselves up. It's a long time to be sitting today. So if you need to stand up and stretch while you're chatting in this next section, by all means do, okay? So we are going to shortly move you into your last activity of the day. We're going to give you just under 25 minutes to start to really now hone in on everything you've heard in relation to buildings, okay? And we're going to ask you a particular question around where might we focus our attention when thinking about reducing emissions from buildings, and why you want to focus in on those areas. Okay, so we're going to try and distill some of what we've heard and get you to have some discussions around that. Remember your conversation guidelines, you know, adhere to those, but I'm going to put you in the trusty hands of your facilitators, and we'll see you back in just under 25 minutes.
I just checked the timescale on that one, because it said in the brief it was going to be 17 minutes. You're saying 25?
We've gathered up some time, so 25. We're going to have 25 minutes. Yeah, just under 25, Paul. Hi all, and welcome back to you all. I hope you enjoyed those discussions. I'm so sorry I cruelly gave you extra time that you didn't actually have. For some of you that may have been a blessing, not a curse. So I just wanted to say, before we wrap up this session, we understand that for some of you, yeah, everything you've heard, it can feel quite overwhelming. You know, I would just kind of like you to reflect back to Lorraine Whitmarsh's presentation that she shared with you earlier. So this is the graphic that's come out of that. we recognise that this feels like a massive challenge. You know, everybody will be feeling that. There won't be anybody sitting here not feeling that. But what I would say is that hopefully what you're hearing is there are solutions out there, you know, and so that's what we just hang on to, the fact that we can do something to combat this. You know, it isn't a completely hopeless scenario. But if you are feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling like it's a massive challenge, that's because it is. And that's exactly why we're running a Climate Citizens Assembly with you. So that's all we're going to say on that front. I just want to give you a few kind of housekeeping reminders for the next sessions, really. So just the first thing, you're going to be in totally different groups tomorrow. So we're going to mix you all up for tomorrow, and we will mix you up again for that second weekend that we're going to have with you. Remind you that the support is out there if you need it. Anybody wants to contact Francis, or anybody that's feeling kind of really overwhelmed and wants to talk to wellbeing support, it's there if you need it. Just let us know that. Tomorrow's session will start at 10. You will be able to log on from 9:45. And if you look out for the Zoom link, that will come to you tomorrow morning at about 8 o'clock. So keep your eye open for that. I want to say well done, a brilliant day, a heavy day, a tiring day. So you all deserve to go off and have a lovely, relaxing evening. And we really look forward to seeing you all again in the morning from 9:45. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you again to our speakers, and have a great night.